ipepe, ipepe, idede, idede, ipede, pede, ritmo.
Oh, natatandaan niyo yan. Galit na galit nga kayo eh, no? Bibilis niyo mag-share eh, no? Pero looking at the bigger picture, lalo pang pinag-usapan nun ng federalismo. Now that I've got your attention, let's talk about federalism. Ano bang pinagkaiba ng current structure of territorial administration natin versus federalism? Kasalukuyan tayo nasa unitary structure of territorial administration, kung saan ang mga lalawigan ay binibigay ang halos lahat ng pera nila sa Malacanang. At ang Malacanang ay nagbibigay ng budget sa mga lalawigan para sa kanilang mga proyekto. Whereas federalism, may ilang porsyento lang na pera ng lalawigan ang pupunta sa Malacanang. Ang karamihan nito ay hawak na ng region, kung saan sila ang bahala kung paano ito gagastusin para sa pagpupunlad ng kanilang rehiyon. Kakaroon din sila ng kakayahang gumawa ng mga policies o tax incentives para umakit ng mga investors at kumpanya para dumami ang mga trabaho sa mga mamamayan ng rehiyon. Ang taray nun di mas malaki yung chance na mangurakot yung regional politicians kasi mas malaki yung perang hawak nila. Good question. Dito papasok ang parliamentary form of government. Side note, walang double taxation kapag nag-federalism tayo, bakla. Kasi ang mangyayari ay split taxation, kung saan yung same percentage na nababawas sa tax mo ngayon ay mahahati lang sa dalawa, kung saan yung isang part ay pupunta sa national at yung isang part ay pupunta sa regional. Ganun. Pakapaniwala kayo sa fake news, perfecto sa ako kayo. Okay, back to the topic. Hindi kasi sapat na maging federal lang ang structure of territorial administration natin. Kailangan din natin ng parliamentary form of government. Bakit? Dahil kapag nanatili tayo sa current form of government natin, which is presidential, ang mga registered voters pa rin ang boboto sa magiging leader natin. Based ito kung sino ang may sikat o matunog na pangalan, apelido, o magandang jingle na ginamit ng eleksyon. Pero sa parliamentary form of government, ang iboboto ng mga registered voters ay isang party at ang nanalong party ang mamimili na magiging leader natin. Based ito kung sino sa kanila ang pinakamagaling, sipag, matalino, karapat-dapat na maging leader. Meaning, makakasigurado tayo na may utak at kakayahang mamuno ang magiging leader natin. Hindi yung nadaan lang sa exposure ng mga bias sa TV advertisements at post ng mga bayarang media. Huwag nga ako. Sa parang ito, maiwasan natin ang popularity contest at dynasty. Quality leaders. Ganun. Sa parliamentary, may magbabantay sa kilos ng isang department. Kaya yari sila kapag may ginawa silang hocus-pocus aka corruption. Wherein sa presidential, mas malaki ang chance na magkaroon ng sabwatan o kampihan para makakickback sa pera ng bayan. I'm talking to you. Pork barrel scam? Huwag ganun. Bad yun. Sa parliamentary, bukod sa nanalong party na binoto ng mga tao, magkakaroon ng shadow opposition na nakabantay sa bawat kilos na nakaupong politician. So meron tayong prime minister at head minister sa bawat department. Tapos magkakaroon din tayo ng shadow prime minister at shadow head minister sa bawat department na galing sa opposition. Kaya kapag hindi nag-perform ng maayos ang isang politician, madali itong makita at mapapalitan. Parang hindi natubuan ng sungay ang mga hinayupak na yang king ina. Ito ang mga sample ng bansa na gumagamit ng parliamentary. Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Germany, Switzerland. Mayayaman, te. Ayaw mo nun? At ito naman ang mga bansang gumagamit ng presidential. Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, Venezuela. Ano na, hindi mo pa rin nakikita? So, in conclusion, meron tayong tinitignan dalawang klase ng structure of territorial administration, which is unitary versus federalism. Dalawang klase ng form of government, which is presidential versus parliamentary. Ang current na meron tayo ay unitary presidential. At ang mas kailangan natin, at ang gusto naman talaga ni Tatay Digong, is federal parliamentary. Ay, thank you. So ano, okay na? Malinaw na ba? Tanggalin niya si Mocha, walang kwenta. So wala ka naintindihan sa mga pinagsasabi ko? Federalismo, ayaw niya talaga nung kanta. Tinry ko lang. Sorry na. Hi guys! Last video, tinalakay natin ang ibig sabihin ng Federal Parliamentary. Ngayon, let's look at the CONCOM draft proposal. Alam niyo ba, nang sinabit na draft ng CONCOM kay President Duterte ay Federal Presidential. Tinamaan ng tipaklong tong mga. Ano ba yung CONCOM? Ang CONCOM o Consultative Committee ay isang grupo na inassign ni President Duterte para mag-submit ng isang proposed draft na ang goal ay palitan ng current 1987 Constitution natin. Sila ay composed of 14 lawyers, 2 retired military men, 2 retired university heads, 2 political scientists, 1 Catholic priest law professor, and 1 business economics technocrat. Anong meron sa draft na sinabit nila? Good news, federalism ang gusto nila mangyari. Yun! Ayos na! Bad news, presidential system pa rin sa national level ang nilagay nila. nang yan, no? Bakla, ano na? Prone pa rin tayo sa Dynasty Popularity Contest China pag ganun. Ang kailangan natin is parliamentary, te. Federal parliamentary. Link on the description kung bakit. More bad news, 60-40 and other anti-FDI policies were not removed. Teka, ano ba yung 60-40 na yan? Ang 60-40 restrictions na under ng Filipino First Policy ay nilagay para ilimit ang pagpasok sa bansa ng mga foreign direct investors o FDI. Dahil ang chikan on, baka daw masakop na naman tayo ng mga dayuhan kung marami ang papasok na FDI sa atin. May trust issues sa mga bakla. Kaya kung ikaw ay isang MNC o multinational company at gusto mo mag-invest ng negosyo sa Pinas, dapat makahanap ka ng local Filipino partner mo na kung saan 60% ng pag-aari ng kumpanya mo ay nakapangalan sa kanya at 40% lang official na magiging pag-aari mo. Ganun. So anong sabi ng mga fam? That's huge! That's not fair, dude. We'll just go somewhere else. Ayun, nagsipuntahan sila ngayon sa ibang mga bansa na walang anti-FDI restrictions o 60-40 policy gaya ng Singapore. Alam nyo ba, na sobrang dami ng FDI na nag-set up ng business sa kanila. Kasama na doon yung famous landmark nila na Marina Bay Sands na majority ay pag-aari ng isang American company. Pero nasakop ba sila? Hindi, di ba? Mas yumaman pa nga, te. Alam nyo bang dati silang third world country at mas mayaman pa ang Pinas sa kanila noong 1950s at 60s. Pero ngayon, dahil sa tulong ng mga FDI, first world country na sila. Bitch. Kaya tayo, nga. Dahil sa 60-40 na to at kung ano-ano pa mga restrictions na nagdi-discourage sa mga fam na pumasok sa atin, tayo na lang ang nag-iisang bansa sa buong mundo na may ganitong klaseng restrictions. Oh, gulat ka. Tanga ka eh. Easy. Ang resulta, sobrang baba ang nakukuha nating investment sa mga MNCs kumpara sa mga karating nating bansa. Kaya konti lang ang mga magagandang trabaho sa Pilipinas at napipilitan ang mga Pilipino na maging OFW at malayo sa kanilang mga pamilya. And here's where the drama starts. Dear Kuya Aris, at dahil dito, ang daming pamilyang nawawasak. Mga mag-asawang nagkakahiwalay dahil sa LDR. Mga dumadaming married sa Pinas pero single sa abroad na civil status. Mga magulang na nag-a-abroad at naiiwan ang mga anak. Hindi nagagabayan ng tama hanggang sa malihis ng landas at mauwi sa mga bisyo o paggamit ng droga.
My God, I hate drugs.
Lahat ng ito, Kuya Aris, ay bunga ng pagiging malayo sa pamilya. Dahil sa kakulangan ng magagandang trabaho sa Pilipinas. Kung walang 60-40 at hahayaang makapasok ang mga FDI, tataas ang sweldo ng mga Pilipino. Paano? Kasi we will have more investors, more companies, more jobs, and more money. Everybody happy. Ayaw nyo ba nun? And there's more. As in, more tax revenues din ang papasok para magamit sa pagpapagawa ng mga government infrastructures, pagpapabuti ng kanilang serbisyo, less unemployment, less poverty, less crime, less broken family. Hindi na kailangan mag-OFW, diba? Tapos sasabayan pa ng federalism na kung saan ay magiging regional ng economic development. Hindi na tayo magsisiksikan sa Imperial Manila at mag-aagawa ng trabaho doon. Wala na ring Manila rate at provincial rate. Ang trabaho na ang lalapit sa'yo. Gondo, diba? Kaya kung ikaw ay katulad ko na gusto ng tunay na pagbabago, share this video. Let's spread this info sa lahat ng kapwa natin Pilipino. Tag mo yung tropa mong tamad mag-google at mag-research. At kung nag-agree ka sa mga pinagsasabi ko, below sa list of contacts ng mga personalities na pwede nating i-message to say na we want a federal parliamentary type of government na may pro-foreign direct investments. O anong gagawin natin dyan? Spam nyo. Easy. Hindi, paulan natin ang message saying na ito ang gusto natin, na ito ang kailangan ng bansang Pilipinas, na ito ang boses ng mamamayang Pilipino. Spam nyo.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Orion Perez Dumdum, and I'm here to welcome everyone to our very, very interesting show right now. Actually, the show that we're going to have is a discussion. It's basically a dialogue with an expert practitioner that I've met. He really knows his stuff about the parliamentary system because he works in one. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to introduce to you my discussion partner today. His name is Emmanuel Doy Santos Jr. You can call him Doy Santos, and he actually is he hosts this blog called the CUSP PH, and he talks a lot about very expert policy proposals and analysis about what's wrong with our country and how to make it better. So Doy actually works as an economist in South Australia, in Adelaide. If you're familiar with Australia, basically South Australia is a state in Australia, and Adelaide is the capital. And he actually works in the I would say the Premier's office. So you know how it is in Australia. They have a prime minister at the very so-called national level, or they call it the federal level. And every state has a so-called mini prime minister for each state. They would call them premiers. And he actually works in the premier's office, basically, or the department of the premier. So without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you this guy who's an expert, and he's actually the son of one of the drafters of the one of the members of the 1971 Constitutional Convention. His father was Emmanuel Noli Santos, a lawyer and also a professor, basically a lecturer on business management and policies, and his son, basically, you'd say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So, without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you Doy Santos of the CUSP Philippines.
Hi.
All right. Welcome.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. Yeah, it's a good thing that we're having this conversation today. Alam niyo naman, pare, a lot of Filipinos in the Philippines are not that familiar with this whole parliament. What's a parliamentary system? Because we never really had one, diba?
That's understandable.
Diba?
Yes,
we never really had one. We were supposed to have one under the Malolos Malolos Constitution. We were supposed to have one, but of course we know that it couldn't happen because the war with the Americans was happening at the same time. So naudlot siya. And then 1973 Constitution was on paper supposed to be parliamentary, and hindi rin siya natuloy kasi martial law was actually happening at that point in time. So how can you have a parliamentary system when you don't have a parliament? Because at that point in time, Congress was dissolved. So
yes. And even when they set up the Batasang Pambansa, in 78, my dad actually ran in Metro Manila with Ninoy Aquino in that election. And they were called MPs, members of parliament.
Yes, that's right.
And we had ministries and ministers reporting to Marcos. We had ministries, but we didn't have a prime minister.
That's right.
Berata was supposed to be the PM, but he never really got to wield true executive power.
That's right.
He was more like Aneda's, like
Yeah, he started off as the finance minister, diba? Parang he was like the chief. Parang he would be like the treasurer in Australia, right? And so he was the chief, or like in the UK, the chancellor of the exchequer. Parang that's what he was essentially. So he was a chief economics and finance technocrat.
Well,
and then, diba?
I wouldn't even go so far as to say that. I think he was just like a NEDA chief, planning
something like a NEDA chief,
negotiating with the World Bank, because treasurers are really very powerful in a parliamentary system.
Mhm.
So under Marcos, he was like used as almost like a disinfectant to the international community.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But the person really calling the shots and dispersing the money, you could argue
Was
it
really
wasn't.
Marcos.
Yes, it wasn't
It's
him.
really
It wasn't
Marcos.
him. Yeah.
Actually, yun nga yung kami sa correct movement, we've been trying to dispel this notion that many people have was that ano daw, we had a parliamentary system under Marcos, and then we say no, it didn't happen because at that point in time,
No.
Marcos was both titularly president and prime minister
Yeah.
at the same time.
Yeah.
During the time when Virata, because Virata did not become prime minister until 1981,
No.
diba?
If
It's
you
only
recall,
until
we had a Speaker of the House, which is really a weird scenario.
Mhm.
So anyway,
Yeah. So if I recall, yun nga so Virata was made prime minister at that point when martial law was lifted, and
yeah,
Marcos had some new amendments that actually shifted the Philippines away from a parliamentary system. Bigla tayong naging on paper semi-presidential a la France, but
yeah, yeah.
actually our
That's it.
system was much closer, much closer to Peru. Peru has a
Mm.
their system of government is that they have a president who is both head of state and head of government, and then they have a prime minister who is actually a an assistant of the president.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Essentially, you would say like a glorified executive secretary. That's kind of like
Mm-hmm.
what
Mm-hmm.
what seems to have happened because he was
Yes.
supposedly the head of the cabinet, though, diba? So
Mm-hmm.
yun. But yeah, we never really had a parliamentary system in the Philippines.
No, and up to this day, the experience of the 71 con leading to martial law um, has always been used as the bogeyman for why we should never entertain any notions or proposals to try and shift us away from the current system that we have. However, if you think about it, why do we keep uh, ending up in the same scenario? What am I talking about? I'm saying from the 1935 Constitution under the U.S. Commonwealth to martial law to President Marcos, 1971 or 72, let's say. You take away the Japanese period. That's around 30 years or
Hmm.
so, 30 years. And then we ended up with a dictatorship, So we had 20 years, 15 under, autocracy. And then we reverted back to this constitution in 88, which was similar to the 35 constitution. May mga minor tweaks lang here and there. But essentially, we restored the old order. And then, so that's from 86 to 2016, that's another 30 years. We end up in the same situation where with President Duterte. And many are saying he's a dictator, he's the second coming of Marcos, or whatever they want to say. But they never really, so be that as it may, you may be pro Duterte, anti Duterte. I'm not really here to argue I'm not here to argue politics. But hindi ba natin naiisipan na eto na naman tayo, why do we end up here again? We keep trying the same solution, but we end up with the same problems of underdevelopment, inequality, lack of investment, lack of opportunity, all of these things. And we keep saying, oh no, we can't change the system kasi mauulit yung nangyari under Marcos. Whether we do so or not, it just happens, di ba? It just happens. We keep and our transition to democracy has exhibited what some writers call the perils of presidentialism. where there's been this, and the Philippines has been cited as one country in particular which has demonstrated the perils of presidentialism, in that its transition to democracy. First of all, the establishment of democracy was interrupted several decades ago with martial law. And then after that, eto na naman tayo. I mean, we went through EDSA 1, 2, 3, instability, and then 2016, some say this is upending the old order EDSA regime again. And so we need to examine kung bakit ba paulit-ulit lang nangyayari to. Like, we seem to be in this endless cycle. Ano? Something has to change.
Indeed. Actually, when you mentioned the perils of presidentialism, yun nga yung problema natin. It's that's actually the perils of presidentialism. If I'm not mistaken, is actually the title of an essay, and then it became a paper by the late Dr. Juan Lintz, who was he's half Spanish,
from
half
1990.
German. Yeah, from the 1990s. Yeah, and he basically did a study of being a basic comparison of this huge basket of presidential systems versus this huge basket of parliamentary systems. And he said, look, parang we see so much instability happening among presidential systems, whereas pag parliamentary, the so-called instability that occurs does not really destroy the country. It just means a change in who's the leader. And the transition that does happen is quite smooth. So parang wala namang gulo actually. Parang I recall myself when I was in Melbourne in 2015 when Tony Abbott was suddenly replaced by Tony Abbott was replaced by Malcolm Turnbull. And it was just like an ordinary day, It's like there was not, it's nothing to it.
You wake up the next morning and there's a new, or like
a new prime minister.
Or in the case of Kevin Rudd, people went to bed one night with 1 p.m. They woke up the following morning with Julia Gillard.
Yeah, exactly. There was no upheaval, it's
no need for people power, no need for people power, storming the Capitol. No need for impeachment either. No need for very costly exercise that just distracts us from the task at hand, which is to improve the lives of ordinary Filipinos, di ba? So what I'm going to be discussing hopefully today with you are, because, a lot has been written since the early 2000s about a lot of empirical papers that show that parliamentary systems outperform presidential in a number of good governance indicators, such as control of corruption, rule of law, bureaucratic quality, as well as some economic indicators, GDP, per capita, trade openness, telecoms infrastructure, inflation, you name it, inequality. I'm not here to argue I'm not here to talk about the empirical papers, although they are impressive and quite important, statistically significant results, I'm an economist, by the way. So when I argue, I always try to use evidence, empirical evidence, not just my own opinions. But so it's been established, and your group, CoRRECT Movement, has actually done a good job in educating the public as to these findings already. So we're not going to canvass those issues anymore. What I want to do is answer the question, why? How does a parliamentary system operate from the inside? Because that's my perspective. In answer to the question, why does it perform better? Kasi yung mga empirical studies niyan, they're like a black box, You determine whether yes or no parliamentary outperforms presidential. That's the hypothesis. And the studies have shown that yes, it does. These are by academic, journal published refereed papers now. But they don't answer the question, bakit? Bakit mas mahusay, mas efficient, mas effective ang parliamentary system? So ngayon, sa palagay ko, I'm in a good position to answer that question. Having worked in it for the last 15 years, I work in, as you said, the Department of the Premier and Cabinet of state government in Australia. And we are a parliamentary system. And I have seen the inner workings of the system from the inside. And so what I'm about to share are just some of the things just from the top of my head that we could cite as the reasons why parliamentary systems perform better than presidential systems.
That would be really great. Yeah, let's go ahead and do it. Let's talk about the advantages and why we have these
Sure.
advantages. All right.
Okay. So let's start first of all with, as you already alluded to, the transition of power, the peaceful handover of power. We can contrast the transition period under presidential systems where there's such a long interregnum between the election of the president-elect and his or her assumption to power. In the United States, for example, the election was held, I think, November 3, the 3rd of November. And President Joe Biden was just installed last week, January 20. So ilang araw yon, ilang buwan yon. That's at least
Parang it's a month and it's 2 months and 20 days, something to that effect, right?
Something like that, So there's such a long process of transitioning. And within that period, as we have seen, a lot of things can happen, right? Such as in the case of Trump, where he issued pardons to his cronies, who were indicted or even convicted, of lying to federal authorities, of covering up, of doing all sorts of shenanigans, And he's not the first president to do that. Others have already done that before him. So there's a long established tradition of pardoning those people, your henchmen, who've gotten into trouble because of you. And then what else did he do? He rallied his base. He called the election illegitimate. He rallied his base. They stormed the Capitol. We can see that now, how chaotic and anarchic it is, because he has the opportunity.
If I may, I recall nga nangyari dyan, some of my CoRRECT members, sabi nga nila, finally, the U.S. has become what it really is, essentially a Latin American presidential democracy.
No, I mean,
kasi ganun sila eh. Yung mga ni Lintz, Juan Lintz, when he was talking about perils of presidentialism, he really showed about how many third world countries na naka-presidential, laging ang gugulo. And him being half Spanish and basically raised in Spain, yung tutok niya was on Latin America, and he kept on saying, talagang tingnan niyo, bulok ganyan. And then he said, US nga lang, for some reason, the US is the only one na parang immune so far. And now it's no longer immune. It's talagang, tingnan niyo what happened. It's finally, naging Latin American country talaga siya, full blown.
Yeah. And the Philippines is the same, the midnight appointments, the whole Corona impeachment trial was because there was what they called a midnight appointment by Gloria Arroyo, before she stepped down or during the campaign period. So Corona was confirmed as Supreme Court Chief Justice during that time. Under a parliamentary system, there is no opportunity to do such things during the interim period, during the lame duck period, because transitions are brutally swift. Normally, when the election is called and one party has the majority or can form government in coalition, let's say with another party, basta once they form the ruling majority na, the next day they're out. They're out of office. There's no opportunity for these kinds of shenanigans. It is so brutally swift. Yun nga, natulog ka ng isang gabi, pagising mo, iba na yung yung government, no? Yung prime minister. They're out of there. In fact, they already start packing when the election is called. You know, so
Nagre-ready na sila. Nagre-ready na sila.
the ministers, the head of government. So, pag in-issue na yung writs for the election to be called and Parliament is dissolved, what happens there is the civil service actually, and this is my second point, the civil service assumes responsibility for the government. The politicians are no longer running the show. They enter a period called the caretaker period. So kami, yung mga civil servants, usually the head of my department, the chief civil servant, siya yung acting. And during the time that under caretaker mode, they are not allowed to appoint people. They're not allowed to enter into contracts. Everything is frozen, no, until the end, until a new government is sworn in. So walang pagkakataon na pwede silang gumawa ng ng kalokohan diyan, ano. In fact, the politicians
in a way, Doy, para silang naka-autopilot, no? Parang kumbaga kung sa piloto pa 'yon, it's like, you know, the pilot is giving it over to the he hands it over to the co-pilot or something like that.
To the professional.
It's a very fast
bureaucrats.
one. And in case kailangan mo nang mag-CR nung isa, they put it on autopilot, diba? So parang it stays stable muna yung eroplano, hindi siya gugulo, parang
the head of the civil service takes over the reins during the caretaker period. Now you might say that's risky, but they're not allowed to make major decisions. They're just running services.
Basically, yung mga budget things like parang running services. So based on decisions that have already been made. Not making new decisions, but decisions that are already according to plan are just going to be executed along.
So wala nang mga cabinet decisions at that point. Wala nang umaakyat sa kabinete. We do something else during this time. But let me just say that even the politicians have already packed their bags. They've put their things into boxes. They're ready to go. So if there's a change in government, if they lose the election, handa na silang umalis. That is from day one of the campaign. Hindi yung pag meron ng resulta yung election. Hindi. From day one of the campaign period, naka-impake na sila. Handa na silang umalis and return to the opposition. The civil servants are driving it. And ang ginagawa namin kapag ganon, during that time, so wala na mga cabinet decisions na kailangan i-process, what we do is we prepare incoming government briefs or IGBs. So this is a practice that is observed in Britain, Australia, and where we observe, nagmamasid kami, tinitignan namin yung mga campaign promises ng isang partido and both parties or all parties, if there's 3 parties. We list down their campaign promises, and what we do is we prepare a brief for each of them na may isang portfolio na ganyang kakapal na bawat campaign promise, we analyze it and we prepare a incoming government brief where we say, ito yung pinangako nyo ng kampanya. This is how you can implement it. And usually, the government's brief is that thick, mas manipis, whereas the opposition's brief, mas makapal. Bakit? Because the opposition might not be familiar with the government agencies, who to contact, which agency to assign. No, they might not be familiar, particularly if they've been in opposition for a long time. So the incoming government brief is, if you like, a handbook or a manual ready-made, so that on day one, when the incoming government assumes office, the first thing that we do is we lay that to them and we say, these are all your campaign pledges. You want to fulfill them. Here's a roadmap for doing that on day one. Now, they can discard it. They can say, no, we have our own methods, or we don't want to listen to you. Bahala sila. Pero at least, nakalatag na para sa kanila, no? hindi na sila nangangapa. Di katulad nung, I think, nung panahon ni President Aquino, yung executive order niya, number 1, turned out to be, they had to rescind it kasi
Parang may
mali.
mga mali. May mga mali. Oo.
Nagkamali sila, natapilok na sila on day 1. And that to me is a sign na, because, you know, they were in opposition. Gaano katagal si Gloria nasa poder, no? For 10 years, or almost
Oo,
9
oo.
years. So, hindi sila sanay. Their people were out of, his appointees were like, parang mga...
Total newbies,
sinabi
greenhorns
natin-
talaga.
Yes,
Greenhorns
exactly.
sila.
Sabi nga ni Joker Arroyo, student council ang dating, di ba? So, para ma-avoid yon, usually the civil service holds their hand, and usually this is more useful if you're from opposition going into office. No? Kapag incumbent ka na na-re-elect, there's less of a need for that. But yun ang practice, yun ang ginagawa na. And I've gone through 2 cycles already of preparing these incoming government briefs. I just noticed that even Joe Biden, they're saying now nangangapa na parang mabagal.
Mabagal, no?
And the other thing that slows them down is yung appointment ng cabinet, because all their cabinet officials need to be confirmed by the Senate.
Nako, yeah, that's another one too. Yeah, I recall Francis Fukuyama basically said in several of his books and in a particular lecture. We have a copy of that lecture that we've put up in our page, no? In our Facebook page.
Professor of Political Economy, Stanford.
Yeah. Si Francis Fukuyama, Dr. Francis Fukuyama basically said, he prefers that the US becomes a parliamentary system rather than presidential because parliamentary systems work better. And he said, one of the things down a real major difference is whenever you have a change in administration in a parliamentary system, you probably just change at most 50 people. Whereas at most 50 people or 100 people at most, including siguro mga assistant if ever, but yeah, it's just around a handful, just like 100. Whereas sa presidential system ng US, it's like 5,000 people that are changed at one go.
Yes.
And
That's the blue book.
The blue book, right?
Yeah.
So parang ang daming taong kinakailangan.
In the Philippines, it's 15,000.
Oh my God, yeah. That's even worse.
So,
oh my God.
Kasi hanggang division chief ina-appoint na, the president, the appointive power. But just going back to the cabinet itself, of course, in a parliamentary system, they don't need to be vetted. So the reason why there's such a long transition is because during that time, the president-elect is selecting members of his or her cabinet. So binivet sila, in-interview, ganito, ganyan. Trump was not prepared. He didn't think he would win. So he didn't have anybody in mind yet. So President Bill Clinton said that if he could do it all over again, he would be more prepared. Kasi he had to go through, actually yung 2.5 months na yan, it's such a short period for them dahil to complete that process na walang mga skeleton sa closet yung mga appointees mo, it really requires a lot of time. Pero sa parliamentary system, handa na yung kabinete because they don't need to be confirmed because they're elected members of parliament.
They're members of parliament. Yeah.
The only time na you will have to make a last-minute change is if one of the members of the shadow of the opposition frontbench, yung tinatawag na shadow cabinet.
Shadow cabinet.
When they're in opposition, they call them the shadow cabinet. The only reason why magkaka-last-minute change is if may isang hindi na-elect sa kanyang distrito. So hahanap ko ngayon ng replacement. Pero usually, they just pick one from their own ranks. Promote. So, on day 1 of a parliamentary handover, nag-oath-taking na sila. And wala nang confirmation. In the US, it's Senate confirmation. Sa Philippines, may tinatawag na Commission on Appointments.
Yes.
Composed of senators and congressmen. And then, kung naaalala ninyo, yung nangyari kay Gina Lopez,
Oo,
yung
oo. Hindi siya
yung
na-confirm.
election.
Oo.
Hindi siya na-confirm, no, hearing kasi, and she spoke something, and she didn't play the game. Hindi siya naki-ride on. Kasi usually, ang hinihingi ng mga members ng Commission on Appointments is scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Ibig
Yeah,
sabihin,
yeah.
para makuha mo yung boto ko, para makumpirma ka, mag-side deal tayo rito.
You
Meron
have to
akong
do
kailangan
something for
sa'yo.
me. Oo,
Yes,
oo,
yes.
oo.
Na isang source ng corruption yan.
Yes, yes.
No?
Yes. And
Under
many people forget that corruption is not necessarily a transfer of money. It's
no.
also a transfer of deal, parang side
Parang,
deals. Na,
i-appoint mo yung bata ko as as assistant secretary sa environment.
Yes,
No?
yes.
At ako, congressman ako, meron akong mines doon sa probinsya ko. Hawak ko yung mga mining license sa amin. So, okay. Yung nag-approve ng licenses, i-appoint mo bata ko. Pero syempre, hindi lumalabas yun sa hearing.
Yes, yes.
Behind the scenes yun nangyayari, no? May
Kaya
accommodation na nangyayari. So this is what they call about an elite accommodation takes place behind the scenes. Hindi natin nakikita, hindi nare-report. Pero andyan yan sa presidential. Sa parliamentary, hindi pwedeng mangyari yan kasi they have a mandate. They were elected by the people. As members of parliament, they're part of the shadow cabinet. They can hit the ground running from day one. Wala nang worry na hindi ako mako-confirm. I have 90 days na sumipsip, umattend ng hearing. Meanwhile, the departments need leadership. Or you start taking a certain course in your department, bigla kang hindi na-confirma, biglang magkakaroon na naman ng panibagong appointee or i-extend yung appointment mo. And then eventually, let's say, as in the case of Miriam Santiago, hindi ka talaga na-kumpirma. And then, bago na naman. So, bago ng secretary, bagong direksyon na naman. So, this causes a lot of delays in the presidential system, and that's why it's very slow to get its agenda implemented. No?
So, kumbaga lumalabas, it's also slow and very, very wasteful. So, daming pera na parang nasasayang.
And
money
maraming talent.
Oo.
Maraming like si Gina Lopez, ano? Gina Lopez is a prime example. Na sayang si Gina Lopez na she's such a powerful voice and a good talent to have had. But because of the system that she was put in, in a parliamentary system, she would have been given an electorate where it was safe for her to run. Siguradong panalo siya. And then, she would be shadow environment minister as in the opposition. And then, so pag na-elect siya doon, siguradong
sigurado na siya yung environment minister.
Oh, and familiar na siya sa portfolio because the shadow cabinet, when they're in opposition, they receive
all of the briefs, all of the documents, and all of the all the paperwork.
And they formulate policy. Policy formulation and by parties is one of the preconditions for continuous growth. Tim Kelsall has found, So this is one of the reasons why a parliamentary system fosters greater competence in policymaking, because both the parties and the bureaucracy are in that mode of developing policies. I talked about the incoming government brief. So that in a way is like when you create a roadmap, you are helping them implement their policy. During the election, I must just backtracking a bit to my earlier point. The politicals are not allowed to confer with us. So they're not allowed to seek our advice because we're supposed to be neutral. If a politician approaches us and says, "Can you tell us what the unemployment rate is going to be next month?" We're supposed to report them because that's an improper act. Impropriety on. Wow. So we observe distance from the politicians, and that allows us to develop independently from them a kind of roadmap. We help them when they are elected. we help them to implement their policy, no? Because we're not elected. But we, the professional bureaucrats, we are mindful of what their promises are, and we help to implement it. So from day one, ready na sila.
I was going to comment no about that part yung about let's say si Gina Lopez was going to be made para bang kumbaga she was already eyed long ago as going to be a environment minister, right? So if the party was still in opposition, she would have already been given an electorate
Where she
where
could
she
run,
was
yes.
she could run and would have
Sure
been
to win.
sure to win. Diba? She would be given a safe seat. Or if if the Philippines were in a different system, like one where we have proportional representation seats,
Oh
she
yeah,
would have
well,
been given some of those. So those proportional representation seats would have been like they're non-constituency, but they
yeah.
are, but they are
Or
full
like,
members.
yeah,
So she would have.
yeah, for
Parang,
sure.
that's what I was gonna say. Na
Like in New
that's why,
Zealand, they have that
yeah,
system.
like in New Zealand, no. So I was gonna say na parang in that argument about the quality of legislators, the quality of the members of parliament, gumaganda kasi yung mga taong magagaling na gusto mong inaay ng party na maging mga ministers in the future, they are the ones they are fielded as candidates in
Yes.
the electorates. So
Yeah, and
they're given these roles, diba?
as a
So
result, they're
nagiging
more accountable to the people.
indeed.
Yeah.
So that's also that's the answer to bakit gumaganda yung quality ng mga tao
So,
sa parliamentary
so
system.
yeah.
Kasi
So
napepuwersa
I
yung
feel like,
party na
yeah,
ipasok
go ahead.
yung mga magagaling, ilalagay nila na ikaw mag-run dito ikaw mag-run dyan. Kasi pag nanalo tayo, pag naging majority tayo, kailangan ko na ikaw ay member of parliament para gawin kitang minister ng ganito.
Yes.
So yung mga people who are being eyed as cabinet ministers are the ones being eyed to run. Binibigyan ng priority to run in electorates.
In a parliamentary system, you essentially have two hats. You're the local member. You represent your electorate. So whatever needs they have, you take note of that. You attend local school openings or whatever. But the other one is as the part of a responsible government, where your career from the time that you are a junior backbencher, you're like a newbie freshman in parliament, to the time that you get promoted into the front bench, backbench, front bench. The cabinet or shadow cabinet sits in the front row. That's what they call backbench, front bench. Kumbaga sa basketball, A team at saka yung mga B team, substitute.
Yes,
no?
indeed.
So their role there is to formulate policy for the team, for the government. And one side effect of this as well is that it's cheaper to run for public office.
Indeed.
Kasi sa presidential, syempre, you have to run at the national level. Magastos. How much did they spend sa US? I can't remember now, but it's firstly, may primary sila, and yun lang, magastos na yun eh. Bumibili ka ng ads, ganito, ganyan. And national yung election mo. So, all the votes are, in our system, all the votes are counted equally. Kasi, unlike in the US, at least may electoral college sila. So, where there are swing states, doon nila binubuhos yung mga advertisements. Pero sa Pilipinas, from Apari to Tawi-Tawi, a vote is a vote. You can substitute one for the other. Under a parliamentary system, the one who is aspiring to become prime minister just needs to run at the local level, needs to win there, and his team needs to win. The party needs to win a majority. So, kung puro local lang yung level, there's no need to have these to wage a national campaign. And at the same time, you're spending for your congressional and Senate, candidates. Under a parliamentary system, isang gastusan lang.
Isang gastusan na lang. Yun nga yung hindi naiintindihan ng maraming tao na parang actually it's going to be cheaper, and plus in order to in order to replicate the the advertisements and the posters across the country, hindi na lang nila nilalagyan ng pangalan ng tao masyado. Kasi ilalagay na lang nila para mas makapag-save sila in many cases, or maybe depends on the country also, no? But para
The
mag-save
party.
talaga, party name na lang at saka yung logo para,
Usually,
'di ba? Para
often ganun.
in District
So,
1 all the way to District 200,
yeah.
they are all using the same materials para economies of scale.
Some people say na ayaw namin na we as Filipinos like to pick our presidents, no? So gusto natin yung showbiz quality ng presidential system. Actually ma-sideline lang tayo, no? When I saw the inaugural, ano ba yung reaction mo when you saw the inaugural ni Joe Biden?
I didn't really get to watch it kasi late na yun eh. So
okay. But
it was really late.
you know, I neither did I, but I watched yung
Replays.
yung speeches, yung fireworks, etc.
Si Lady Gaga lang napanood ko.
Yeah, si Lady Gaga, Jennifer Lopez. Sa loob-loob ko, ang naisip ko, what a waste. Ang laking gastos. Na may pa fireworks pa, may parade, kung ano-ano. And there's all this pomp and pageantry. Under a parliamentary system, there's none of that. Kasi we're just mas humble ang mga leader. Alam mo yon, na hindi kailangan ipakita na because, and think of it, power is concentrated in the president, in one person.
Yeah. No, I think that's so maybe I'll just interject here. Yung bakit nga ba naging masyadong pomp and circumstance yung nangyari sa president? It's because the president is not just the president in a presidential system is not only the head of government, he's also the head of state. Whereas in a parliamentary system, he or she is not the head of state, but is only the head of government. And so the head of government is a very no-nonsense position. You go straight into doing the work, diba? Whereas the pageantry is reserved for the monarch.
It's like a coronation.
It's a coronation.
Inauguration.
Inauguration is like a coronation.
So
diba?
in parliamentary systems, usually there's a symbolic head of state who's usually unelected. Or appointed. Or
in Singapore, what we have is a head of state, the president, who is actually elected, but is very, very ceremonial. So parang doing the same thing that the governor general or the queen would do, but is
you don't really hear about the president of Singapore. I think few people even realize na may president of Singapore.
Yeah. Well, in Singapore, in Singapore, of course, everybody knows who the president is because the awarding ceremonies, yung parang mga,
symbolic lang.
Siya yung gumagawa nun. Tapos yung mga scholarship, the president's scholarship, something like that, or the president's charity ball, may mga ganon. So anything.
He's a non-political, he's a non-partisan person.
Yes.
So ceremonial things.
Pag kunyari National Day, yung Independence Day ng Singapore, the person who gets prime of place is the president. So hindi yung prime minister is like secondary lang siya. Tapos yung mas naka-reserve yung pomp and circumstance, yung mga nagsasaludo yung mga tao doon sa president, not to the prime minister. So
and as a result, they're more down to earth and approachable. The president is shrouded with all of this stuff, no?
It's parang enigmatic stuff, diba?
That my dad, when he was governor of his province and he was appointed by CoRRE, when he approached he knew CoRRE from way back, but when CoRRE was president, he told me he couldn't approach her the way he used to talk to her because he felt the awe. He felt awe for the office. And I think what that does is it inflates your ego. And it makes you feel powerful. They say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Under presidential system, we invest the president so much power. Whereas here in Australia, our prime minister was doing a press conference with the media. I think it was about the bushfires or something.
Outside
And
of
he
a
was doing
house,
it
right?
outside of the
Outside of
house
a
on the
house.
front lawn of this person. And then the guy just opened the door and said, "Hey,
Hey there,
get off my
mate.
lawn."
Get off my lawn, mate. I just cleaned that up. Yung parang sa
Very good.
I just mowed that
Yeah.
lawn yesterday, and then you're stepping on it. What's that? You know what? Parang bogan siya. Parang
And PM
pinagalitan niya tapos
ScoMo,
tumalis yung si
yeah,
ScoMo.
and PM ScoMo, he just told the media, "Yeah, let's get off his property."
Yeah,
Ganun
yeah.
siya ganun siya ka, there's no like reverence. I mean, you might say, and that's the way it should be, because these elected officials are servants of the people.
Servants of the people. Yeah, that's what it is.
We're not meant to worship them or stand in awe of them or feel like put them on a pedestal. But that's exactly what we do under a presidential system.
If I was going to to add kasi there's this 1800s or 19th century writer, Walter Bagehot, British
Yes.
guy, who
British
made a
guy, yeah.
comparison between the presidential and the parliamentary system, and he basically said the advantage of the parliamentary system, the British system, is that they have separated the dignified versus the efficient. So the dignified role is the role of the queen or the monarch, right? So
Yes,
back
yes.
then it was Queen Victoria. And so lahat ng mga parang yun nga yung mga praise na yan, yung mga
Yeah. She's above the phrase. She's above the partisan bickering.
siya. So dun siya. So that's the dignified, no? And it kind of draws ordinary people to respect the institutions through that person. But the efficient side is done by the prime minister and his cabinet.
Yes.
And they are normal, ordinary people. There's nothing
Yes.
special about them. They're just ordinary people doing their job. And
That's right.
so yun yung maganda dun sa system ng
It's very egalitarian.
It's egalitarian.
Very egalitarian. And another thing I'd like to point out, because many people will say, sa parliamentary kasi, there's less checks and balances kasi yung PM is both the and the cabinet is both the executive and they also perform legislative functions. But actually, the separation of powers under a presidential system doesn't always lead to checks and balances, because as we saw under the Trump impeachment and all those investigations in the Senate, and under our own system, that kung may Congress committee, pinatawag yung isang miyembro ng kabinete or official from the executive branch. Minsan, ang ginagamit nilang excuse is, walang pahintulot ng Malacanang. I haven't been cleared by the executive secretary or whoever to appear before you. So, di ba? So, anong nangyari sa checks and balances mo dyan?
Yeah, actually,
na.
What they have in a presidential system nga, hindi na nga siya talaga nagiging checks and balance. Nangyayari is gridlock. What you have is gridlock or deadlock, some people would say. So, bangayan, and then nothing gets done. At least in a parliamentary system, you have there's a more real-time checks and balance, which is
they're more accountable.
More accountable, and it's more real-time. Kasi in the presidential system, it's after the fact. After the fact, na parang, we decided upon it, tapos ipapadala nun ngayon sa presidente. Tapos yung presidente, parang he can just veto the whole thing without really saying, add nyo na lang to, add nyo na lang yan, ayusin nyo lang yan. Wala eh. Talagang, okay, no. Parang, the whole thing gets canceled. Whereas,
the veto power,
whereas in a parliamentary system, ang nangyayari, yes, may bangayan yung government and opposition, and in the process, naaayos, natitweak yung policy. Kasi maybe the opposition might bring up a very valid point and say, this part needs to be changed because this. And if the government sees that, tama yan, they can change the policy. Actually, it's parang more real time yung
two things I will say in response to what you've just said. Now, number one is more real time. So because of question time, the cabinet members are subject, and the prime minister is subject to questioning by the opposition. So you don't need to summon them. to appear, and they cannot refuse not to appear. All right? And this question time happens every week that Parliament sits. So hindi siya special occasion. No? And so that means accountability. They cannot refuse, unlike in the presidential. In the presidential system, they can they can be clear to show up, but in the hearing, they can choose not to answer questions directly.
Grabe.
Hindi
Walang
pwedeng
kwenta.
ganon sa parliamentary. Hindi pwedeng ganon because the members of parliament represent the people, and it's the people's money that you're spending. Ganito, ganyan. So that's point A. Pangalawa, you talked about how the veto power causes a lot of gridlock and partisanship between the president and even members of his own party in Congress. In a parliamentary system, what happens is that the prime minister is a member of cabinet, and it's actually cabinet that is supreme. It's cabinet that makes the executive decisions. They vote, and the PM only has one vote in that cabinet. He can be, or she can be outvoted, But the thing is, when cabinet decides on something, whether it be a new regulation or a new law that needs to be passed, and then they send it to the House, the Parliament, because they already have majority in the House, then it is usually adopted. I say usually because there's party discipline enforced, because if you're a backbencher in a government and you hope to be a frontbencher one day, you will need to toe the party line if you want your political career to progress. No, and usually the party caucuses, the parliamentary elected representatives, they caucus as a party. So even before cabinet meets, na sila, they've ironed out the kinks.
They've ironed out.
So-
Actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is also because of the need for a lot of caucusing. So the party needs to iron out stuff internally. The time, the workload of normal MPs is actually much higher than that of the congressmen or senators in a
Yeah.
presidential system.
So-
They have a lot of free time, eh. Whereas in
In-
a parliamentary system, they have to regularly meet internally before they come on open parliament plenary sessions,
Yeah.
because they have to get
So-
everything ironed out
Right.
prior to that.
So under a presidential system in Congress, what's the highest, if you're a member of Congress, the ultimate for you is to become a committee chair, right?
Yeah.
So what do you do as committee chair?
Not really much. It's just to recommend stuff related to certain legislation. Eh. Parang yun lang eh.
Yeah, you hold hearings.
Hold hearings.
You summon this guy. You say, you bang on your gavel. You say, okay, I don't like what you're saying. You're overruled. Go to the next guy. That's your goal. That's your goal. And so
You're a
if
mini
that's your
speaker.
goal,
Basically, the highest in a presidential system in the lower house is to become speaker, right?
Yeah.
And then so
Yeah.
to become speaker, and then also become mini speakers, because that's what those
yeah.
congressional those committee heads are. They're like mini
Deputy-
speakers.
Yeah. So
They're mini speakers.
since I'm the committee chair, president wants something done, and I don't agree with it, I can just tell him to, pardon my, bugger off,
Yeah.
right? I can just tell him to shove it. Under a parliamentary system, the ultimate goal of a member of parliament, syempre, is to reach the front bench, or maybe even aspire to become treasurer or prime minister one day. So in order to do that, as a front bencher, as a member of cabinet, what is your job as opposed to banging the gavel in the presidential system, holding hearings, this and that, asking me to scratch your back if I'll scratch yours, So parliamentary, as a member of the front bench, you get to wield real power. You get to run agencies. You get to run an agency the way you want, no? So if that's your goal, whatever the PM or the front bench, whatever the team needs from you, if you're a backbencher, you will try to support it. You're not going to be recalcitrant or you're not going to rebel. You need to show them that you're a team player or else you won't get promoted there. Kaya ganun, kaya may party discipline under parliamentary system. Whereas in the States, in presidential, miyembro nga ng kaalyado mo nga eh. Pero hindi pa rin bumoboto in line with whatever your priorities are. Nakita natin yan paulit-ulit. So, anong kailangan mong gawin? Eh, mag-pork barrel ka. Bayaran mo yung tao para bumoto siya in your favor.
Yeah, we actually in the 2013 ba yun, I made an article about the presidential system and the pork barrel, and I explained kaya nga tayo nagkakaganyan kasi nga because of gridlock, we're using a very gridlock prone system. Things rarely get done. So since the executive needs support of the legislature to get its agenda set up, they need to buy the support of
By the
the
votes.
legislature.
Yes.
By the votes, and that's what the
Bribe
pork
them.
barrel
Right.
was. If I'm not mistaken, the start of the pork barrel was that so during the time of Cory, when she was president, there was originally no pork barrel yet. Wala pang countrywide development fund, wala pang PDAF. What we had back then was just, you do your thing based on your own so-called conscience, diba? So to speak. And because ang gulo-gulo talaga ng sistema, ang daming gridlock na nangyayari, ang daming dissatisfaction. So the dissatisfied parties included the RAM, and the RAM started having the coups. So coup after coup after coup after coup. And therefore, they decided that, we need to have a mechanism to stop the gridlock or to minimize it, so that we no longer have these coups. So ayan, let's do the pork barrel. Let's set up the countrywide development fund para mabili natin yung suporta ng mga legislators. Now, that ballooned into becoming the scandalous affair that it has become under yung kay Janet Napoles, diba? So yun yung naging talagang galit na ngayon yung mga tao kasi ang dami na nawawaldas na pera. Sabi ko, well,
because
you
it's so
don't
expensive to run for
expensive.
public office
Yeah.
under presidential system.
Exactly.
In parliamentary systems, may pork barreling then, but it usually goes to the marginal seats.
Marginal seats lang, yeah.
So, hindi siya universal na bawat congressman may parang quota na kailangan cut siya sa budget. Hindi ganun eh. Kasi under presidential system, mismo kapartido mo, kailangan mong bigyan ng prize money para bumoto para sa mga so in line with your agenda, para ipasa yung agenda mo.
It's such a weird system that we have talaga, no? Parang yun nga eh. So it's legalized corruption, basically legalized bribery. What's happening with the pork barrel? So mangyayari dyan, para mawala yan, baguhin na lang natin yung sistema. Mag-parliamentary na lang tayo para wala na tayong ganyang klaseng mega pork barrel. Magkakaroon man siguro tayo ng ganun for the marginal seats na lang, like you said.
But usually it's like infrastructure projects na binibigay. Hindi naman pera. Ina-announce yun during the campaign. So ina-announce yun, pinapromise, pinapangako nila. And and when you talk about opportunity for cheating as well, the elections, because you run a national campaign, so kailangan yung boto mo has to be counted at the precinct level, then at the municipal, then at the provincial, then at the national. And every step of the way, cheating can occur. But under a parliamentary system, all the votes are just counted at the district level.
Indeed.
And what that so because you just need a winner for that district. So and the one who forms a majority in parliament, siya yung nagiging government. Siya yung nagiging incoming government. So wala nang national canvassing of So and walang flying voter na lilipat from one na is a substitute. You can offset your losses in Mindanao your losses in Metro Manila by cheating in Mindanao. Hindi. Under Parliament, kaya dinidelay yung bilangan kunwari sa Mindanao, the perennial situation that we face. Under parliamentary system, kung magkaroon ng dayaan sa Mindanao, it will only just lead perhaps to 1 or 2 additional seats.
Yeah.
And then, pwede pang i-contest yun. So, and at least, the madaling i-audit. Kasi yun lang na-isolate yung problema doon. Kaysa sa, katulad ng nangyari sa vice presidential, some of these senatorial na buong Pilipinas ang scope ng, nung pwedeng maging scope, no? So, naiiwasan yun sa parliamentary kasi district by district lang. And then usually, mas cost-effective nga yung bilangan dahil wala na yung multiple layer and so on and so forth. No?
Actually, ito nga yung isa sa mga napag-usapan namin dati with some other people, no, na we've noticed, like here in Singapore, for example, which is parliamentary, walang PCOS machine, walang PCOS na yung
dito sa Australia, ano ba?
Manual
yung balota namin? Manual, papel lang. Lapis nga lang ang ginagamit namin.
Lapis, di ba?
And wala kami yung indelible ink. Walang ganun. When you show up at the polls, they just ask you, so have you voted today? Have you voted elsewhere? Kasi you can go to a number of precincts, 2 or 3. May option ka. And then you just say yes or no. Tapos tinitik off yung pangalan mo doon, naabot sa yung balota. You put it in a cardboard box. Yung ballot box namin dito. Hindi yung, cardboard
yung
box.
naka-chain, di ba? Meron yung naka-chain pa yun Naka-padlock pa yun
Fiberglass.
Naka-padlock pa yun.
Indelible ink na nabubura din naman kung minsan. Ay, nako, ang daming gastos. And then may mga, ang daming gastos. Or ngayon, yung PCOS machine na bilyon-bilyon ang ginagastos. So, madali lang yung bilangan Hindi ganun ka yung pagbilang ng boto. No? Ron, I noticed we might be over time, or I might be going over time.
Okay. It's okay. We can continue on. If it's actually more like you that I'm concerned about.
Are there any questions? We forgot to say that we're open for questions nga pala, no?
Yeah. I was going to say, if you want to extend a little bit, okay lang din, because I think there's a lot to talk about. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a little short so-called break for me to just basically announce also that this afternoon, mamayang hapon, at 3 p.m., punta po kayo dun sa kay Sas Rogando Sasot, yung For the Motherland Sas Rogando Sasot. She'll be having a discussion with my friend, Dr. Eduardo Araral Jr., who is a professor. He's an associate professor, and he's basically an academic on political science here in School of Government. Lee Kuan Yew School of Government. So kaibigan ko siya, kainuman ko yan madalas dito. So itong si Doc Ed, ayun, mag-uusap sila tungkol sa kapalpakan ng presidential system. So it's going to be today is a good day to learn about bakit maganda ang parliamentary system, and then mamayang hapon on nyo rin yung systems nyo, and listen to what they're talking about. Ano yung mga kapalpakan ng presidential. So, mamayang hapon. Check nyo yan.
Contrast.
Compare and contrast. So we can continue on until kasi another 20 minutes.
We have a few more pointers if we have extra time.
Go ahead. Yeah, we do.
All right. So we've tackled a number of things, that the transition of power is quicker, smoother, caretaker period during elections, so there's no late midnight appointees or shady contracts last minute na ina-award. Yung last 2 minutes ka nga na sinasabi. Cabinet is ready on day 1. And also the first 100 days hitting the ground running because we provide them with incoming government briefs. And in fact, wala nang need for this transition period where in the States there's this obscure office called the Office for General Services that actually has the power to give the president-elect's team authority to confer with the departments. Can you believe that? And Trump's
Gosh.
OGS didn't allow that until several weeks later after the election when the courts had decided.
Weird.
That weird thing doesn't happen sa parliamentary because in fact, we're already preparing the incoming government briefs for them. We are
Actually,
already...
dun pa lang sa pagkakaroon ng shadow cabinet, the shadow cabinet is already, during the time in the previous term, they were already getting ready to become,
Yes.
to be in government. So because they already know what's going on. Kasi, di ba, they're regularly kind of in contact with what, ano bang nangyayari? So they know that. So hindi
Yeah, they
sila
can...
parang naninibago.
Yes. They're busy formulating alternate policies.
Yeah.
Alam nyo, sa sistema natin, we actually have a vice president who's acting as though we're in a parliamentary system. Because
Pero siya yung leader of the opposition.
she likes critiquing the government at every level, at every instance. She only joined the cabinet briefly. She didn't want to be part of it. So what she has done is she's tried to in a way destabilize the administration through her criticisms and in fact trying to promote alternative policies, just like a shadow cabinet would. So she's trying to behave as though she's as if we're in a parliamentary system. So nakakatawa, no? And but anyway, so just moving on, no? So from the first 100 days, hitting the ground running, you have a roadmap. It's cheaper to run elections and campaigns because of the district by district quality. Now I want to tackle the machinery of government, you know.
Sige, let's do that.
Okay, so this term, what we call MOGS, machinery of government in Australia. Did you know that government agencies can be easily restructured under a parliamentary system? Why or how, you might ask? Because the legal entity under a parliamentary system is actually the minister, not the department. So a government can just name this person Minister for Transport, Minister for Infrastructure. And what happens is, or can create a completely new portfolio. Minister for Child Protection is one of those that are really in vogue these days because of all the child abuse cases that are coming out. So hinihiwalay yung dati Department of Education and Child Protection, ngayon may sariling department na siya. Now under a presidential system, for you to effect that change, kailangan pang dumaan sa Kongreso. There needs to be a law passed, you know? So nakakaroon ng debatihan, ganyan. Minsan hindi pa napapasa, right? Like so si Duterte wanted I think PDP Laban wanted to create a department for water, department for OFWs, yung mga ganon.
Mga ganon, yeah.
Hirap gawin. Hindi magawa. Nanalo na nga sila. Hindi pa rin magawa, no? And that's the reason because under a presidential system, yung mga ahensya are like legal entities. In a parliamentary system, it's actually the minister who is the legal entity. So kapag sinetap mo ngayon yung minister for ganitong department na bago, the agency realigns. So these are what we call machinery of government changes. So anong nangyayari? They create a new department. It's changed and register yung business name, ganito ganyan, and people in one department could be reassigned. Ganun ang nangyayari.
So business name, it's considered like a corporate entity, like it's
actually pag may kontrata, and I've seen this happen because I prepared some MOAs or some contracts. It's actually the minister who signs. The minister can delegate the authority to the head of the agency, but the legal part, the one na makakasuhan kung magkaroon ng asuntuhan, is actually the minister. The minister is the one who's the legal entity.
I see.
I learned that. I had to learn that, the hard way. You know, so pagka ganon, madaling i-readjust or mag-reorganize under a parliamentary system kung kinakailangan. And madali ring ibalik sa dati kung kung magkaroon ng kung mapalitan yung gobyerno and gusto nila, you know, baguhin ulit. No? Sometimes that leads to a lot of changes because even within one term of government, minsan nagkakaroon ng changes in, you know, midstream. So minsan kami mga bureaucrats na we feel that ang daming mock changes. Usually sa first 100 days, ang daming changes. So nagre-restructure and they can organize the way they want. So di ba mas maganda 'yon? Ganun, kasi ma-implement mo talaga yung gusto mong agenda na gusto mong gawin. Programa
it's actually
mo,
a lot
no?
more parang ano siya, very corporate. Kasi in the corporate world, this kind of thing happens all the time. So, you know, like a new CEO comes and then he has a different mindset, a different way of understanding efficiency. So he says, okay, I think it's more efficient to do it this way. So he is flexible enough to reorganize things the way he thinks is the right way. So parang it's very, very corporate actually.
The only time we need to legislate if they want to create a new agency is if that agency is going to be independent from the cabinet, such as the anti-corruption agency, no, the ICACs, for example, Independent Commission for Anti-Corruption, mga ganun. Or
that one is that's not controlled by government per se, di ba?
No. They're precisely the point. They have their own statute. They have their own legislation. They're not answerable to the government of the day. No.
Okay.
So, or for example, like Productivity Commission, you want to set up an independent advisory body that you will commission to do work for you, but they're independent. You can't tell them what will be in their report. So kapag ganon, usually may legislation para talagang independent sila. Otherwise, kung hindi, madali silang ma-restructure, di ba? Mamog sila, machinery of government change. Pwede silang mamog or ma-dissolve. Ng ganon. So usually, pagka ganon, doon lang yung time na nagkakaroon ng act of parliament to create specific offices. But or regulatory agencies, kahit na under the minister, pero like the Environmental Protection Agency, kunwari, still under a minister, pero may sarili siyang ano. So, hindi siya nai-impluwensyahan gaano. Pero, nami-minimize, kumbaga, yung mga ganon. If you want to restructure the government departments, you don't have to go through this tedious process of debating in parliament. Wala na, it's your policy and nanalo ka na nga eh. So you should be able to do it. Diba? You should be able to do it. And if you mess up, then you're answerable for whatever your actions are. No? You're subject to question time and all of this and all of that. So, yun ang isa pang advantage now over the presidential system. I already mentioned the fact that in cabinet, the PM is primus inter pares, first among equals, just only has one vote. And cabinet, the common misconception is that people think they equate the prime minister to the president na nag-executive order.
Yeah, they make that mistake. No, it's...
Sa parliament, imagine that, no? Executive orders. Parang batas na rin, parang regulatory na rin yun eh. No? Under a parliamentary system, a prime minister cannot issue executive orders cannot issue executive orders at all. It has to go through cabinet, and the cabinet decides. It's a collegial body.
Yes.
Now, normally, if your leader wants it, if your minister, you go alone.
Walang unilateral decision making.
Walang ganun.
Diba?
Like they say yung executive secretary. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Wala yung idea na isang tao ang nagde-decide tapos susunod ang lahat. It's actually based on the collegial body making a collective decision.
It's not like how George W. Bush said, I'm the decider. they can debate, but in the end, I make the decision. Di ba? Parang ganun si George Will. Hindi ganun eh. Hindi ganun. And in the parliamentary, it's a collegial body. So, yung sinasabi nila, magiging autocratic ang Pilipinas. Magiging dictatorial na naman tayo, under a parliamentary system.
Mali yun.
Ano yung mas dictatorial? A president who can issue executive orders at his whim. Like what Trump did. I rescind the Paris Climate Accord. Ganun na. Tapos
Grabe, grabe. Actually, what many people forget is that a presidential system is actually modeled after a semi-absolute monarchy. That's really what it is. It's based on the system of government that England had when England was still under Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth I. So she was still a powerful monarch, but she also already had she had a legislature that was kind of able to do things slightly separately, but she still had most of the control. Whereas a parliamentary system is no longer that. Parliamentary system, yung ano na siya, yung monarch kasi, or the head of state, has become purely ceremonial, and the real executive power has been delegated to the cabinet, and the prime minister is just happens to be the head coordinator of cabinet. So that's really what it is.
Yeah. So there are two things kasi here. Sometimes when a policy requires legislation to take effect, that needs to be passed through cabinet and then parliament. But if it's simply a regulatory process or procedure, that can just be decided by the minister. So that doesn't require an act of parliament. So usually in cabinet office, we try to distinguish: does this require legislation, and this is just within the purview of the minister. However, the minister normally also takes these decisions to cabinet if it impacts another agency. So, dun lumalabas yung mga cabinet clusters, and sila, collegial body, they decide. And then they elevate it to cabinet, and cabinet, usually, pag ganun, planchado na, cabinet then makes a decision, and it's noted down, may records, ganito, ganyan. Kami, the civil service, you know what we do? We usually comment. So there's usually a submission to cabinet. Ito yung sinatawag na complete staff work, na may proposal, idadaan sa cabinet office muna, and sa budget office. So we provide our comments. The Department of Treasury and Finance provides the budget comment. We provide our cabinet. We can decide to support or oppose the proposal. We also referee. We say, you're sending this to cabinet, but have you consulted with that agency? Have you done this? Have you done that? So the civil service becomes more professional in that manner. And so when cabinet decides, they normally see the proposal, but they also see a one-pager, our comments, and the comments from Treasury, and that carries weight. So what happens under a parliamentary system is that there are better decisions that are made because they're more thought out, they're better coordinated. Unlike in a presidential system where I think there's a lot of emphasis on executive power.
Yeah. It's very top-down in a way, no? It's very top-down.
Yes.
Whereas ang parliamentary is, in a way, it's actually bottom-up because a lot of policies come from the inputs that the MPs get from their constituents, and that moves up to the cabinet, and then the cabinet makes this collective or collegial decision, and then that the decision becomes policy. It's not really something that ito yung gusto ng prime minister, but the prime minister just really takes into consideration what are these very different inputs coming from the different MPs.
Because the secretaries serve at the pleasure of the president, diba? You always hear them say that.
Yes.
So they're kind of beholden to their the one that appointed them, put them there. Whereas in the cabinet of a parliamentary democracy, The ministers, um,
They derive
we're
their
not.
legitimacy from the people who voted for them. Actually,
Yeah,
they
that's
derive
right.
it from their
They're
electoral. Ano, diba?
they're they can vote the PM out if they
Yes,
wanted
indeed,
to.
indeed. Yeah, yeah.
So they're less beholden to the chief executive. They have they can freely express their views as a result. And even if they resign from cabinet, they're still a member of parliament. They can still
Yes,
organize the backbench to remove the prime minister. So they can do
yeah.
a lot of things. So that's why the prime minister usually he keeps his enemies close. You keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So usually he brings his rivals into cabinet so that at least when they're there, he's subject to confidentiality of the cabinet. They're not allowed to leak, although leaks do take place. But that's a breach, no? That's a breach. And so ganun ang disiplina under a parliamentary system, and ganun yung respeto ng bawat miyembro ng gabinete sa bawat isa.
Mm,
Hindi
mm.
sila sunod-sunuran lang. And because of that, better decisions are made. Better, more quality. Kaya you remember we go back, bakit parliamentary outperforms presidential in terms of in terms of what was it? Control of corruption, rule of law, and bureaucratic quality.
Mhm.
It's because the decisions that they made are better informed and well thought out. Because there's consultation and there's kind of that competition of ideas, and they vote as a body. Hindi sila beholden to just one officer, one person. Um, so that's it. And since I've already alluded to the professionalism of the bureaucracy, where does that come from under a parliamentary system? So the professionalism of the bureaucracy, I've already given some examples of that, no? But did you know that sa atin, where I work, there are political appointees pa rin. Ang kaibahan lang is that may kontrata sila, may fixed term usually. And so, ang nangyayari, kapag natalo yung government that appointed them into senior positions, in order to keep their jobs, they try to align themselves now with the new incoming administration. They act professionally. They say, hindi porket I voted for somebody else, I'm not going to serve. They make themselves available. And I've seen people who are members of a certain party who became directors, executive directors, and so forth. When a new government steps in, in order to renew their contracts, they try to demonstrate that they can be useful to the incoming government. Now, the incoming government might choose to replace them, but what I have observed is that they normally just replace a few people, usually the chief executives of the agencies are replaced, but the people below are usually untouched because they actually need them. Lalo
So
na
when
if they've been in opposition for a
when you
long
say the
time.
chief executive of a department, that would be very much similar to the permanent secretary in
In a Westminster
in
system.
West
Yeah.
in the UK, or say
Yeah.
in Singapore.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In the UK kasi sa Westminster, mas I don't know if they still observe that. We used to observe that here in Australia where civil servant yung nagiging head ng agency. So there's a distinction between the minister and the head of the agency. And usually
Yeah.
under a Westminster system, these two could actually be in conflict with each other. The head of the agency doesn't necessarily need to agree with the minister and can do their own thing. And the show Yes Minister.
Yes, yes,
And the
minister. Yes,
BBC.
that's an
That's
old
where that comes from. That's where that comes from. It's how they run circles around the minister, and through bureaucratic speak or whatever. So it's a certain quirk of the Westminster system. Now, the Australian system is they modify this so in order to bring the bureaucracy to heel. The senior executives, they've created a senior executive service, no? Similar to what we call the CESO in the Philippines. No?
Yeah.
These are civil servants, but the political appointees can be appointed to these, pero piling-pili lang siya. Yung mga managers, civil servants na yun, below director. And not all directors are political appointees. Pero
Okay.
usually, pag nangyari yun, may fixed contract sila. So that at least the government can push through with its agenda. But the rest of the bureaucracy are civil servants. So, trabaho
So
lang kami.
the way I see it, no, the way you're explaining it, how the Australian system works is this would be very, very ideal for the Philippines to copy, because the same concept exists with what we have right now, where right now, so the functions of the president are going to be put over to the prime minister, and the prime minister, who may sometimes need to bring in expert advice from outside, can put in some people to act
Yes.
as the heads of the departments, like some similar to a consultant from outside. But that yun yung magiging trabaho nila, no? Yung mga senior, yung chief executives na
Yes.
sinasabi mo.
Yes, they can appoint their own heads of agencies, and then the heads of agencies can appoint the executive directors, the directors that they so choose, you know. So
Okay.
so usually, but they give them fixed contracts. Now sa Philippines, meron tinatawag na CESOs, civil executive service officers.
Mhm.
These are up to assistant secretary or undersecretary, I don't remember. They can occupy that. Now they have security of tenure. They are not political appointees. However, meron ding political appointees who can occupy the same positions, but they also have to meet the same requirements. So yun lang ang kaibahan eh. But then, usually they say, I'm coterminous. Parang open-ended yung appointments. I'm coterminous with the president, or I serve at, sa system, they can think of another system where fixed term lahat ng senior executive. So, kapag civil servant ka, katulad ko, I'm just in the sort of the borderline between that and the ano kasi. You can choose to remain as, at a lower position pero may security of tenure ka. Or you can try to go to become a director pero wala kang security of tenure. Every 3 years, renew ng contract, or you find other work. So it's similar to like a professional corporation, no? Well, the way a professional company is run.
It's very similar to the private sector. Yeah, and I think that's
Yeah,
one of the key advantages that I've seen, and that's the reason why a lot of economists and business people who know the difference between the two systems, actually they prefer the parliamentary system, because it's much more corporate like. It's much more parang private sector. The efficiency that we have
yeah,
in the private
yeah,
sector is also present in a parliamentary system.
yeah. So those are the things, and reforms are swiftly enacted. I've already explained that. Once it's approved in cabinet, usually because they control the majority, it passes through Congress, through Parliament, relatively smoothly. If you have a Senate, though, that might in Australia, the Senate, kasi they can only block budget appropriations, but they cannot block other pieces of legislation. They can suggest improvements, but they cannot block only yung mga budget appropriations. Then that's what happened under Tony Abbott, and that's one of the reasons why he was rolled, because of his budget measures. But generally speaking, reforms are swifter, and the professionalism of the bureaucracy and of the parties follows from these practices that I've mentioned. Some say, kahit ano pang sistema ang gawin nyo, kung hindi magbabago ang tao, ganun pa rin. It will be the same corrupt, inefficient system. What they fail to recognize is that it's actually the practices, not the structure itself. But these practices flow from the structure. So
Indeed.
because of it's like it's like if you've chosen a certain architecture. A lot of an architect will tell you this. A lot of the sometimes the form, the function follows the form, because you've created, let's say, an open space office. They say it allows for collaboration, yung mga ganyan. So the design dictates how people kind of behave and the practices they observe. If they're like spaces for collaboration and so forth. But if you're like in individual offices, for example, everybody has an office, so they're siloed in those offices, it discourages certain forms of behavior. And as a result, performance changes. Now, you may argue that one is preferable to another for certain goals, but as we've seen in dealing with complex policy challenges, as what we're facing now, like climate change, poverty, you name it, terrorism, insurgency, all of these are complex policy. Some call them wicked problems.
They have to be dealt with holistically in many ways.
Exactly.
You can't just do it siloed based. The siloed based.
Yeah. So the structure which encourages people to be more collegial, to coordinate, to collaborate, is probably the one that will outperform. And a system where they're more down to earth and accountable and approachable to the people, and can be where things can be made more transparent because they're accessible in Parliament through question time and all of those things. It will encourage better performance, and that has been observed through the empirical studies. All that I've just done here is hopefully shown people that these are the practices. It's an ecology of practices within this system that fosters this kind of behavior and culture. And then the culture, and the culture arises out of that pattern of behavior. I think.
I just wanted to show here some of these, yung mga, what do you call this? This is coming from the CoRRECT website, correctphilippines.org/parliamentary_info. And at the bottom part of the page, we have some of these like old useful country rankings. So dito, makikita natin yung there's this, for example, ranking of top 30 countries based on the Heritage Foundation's Economic Freedom Index. So you can see here, balikan ko, sorry. So you can see here na yung majority ng top 30 countries, majority of them are parliamentary.
Green.
The ones in green are parliamentary. Ganon din sa Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, majority of the top 30 are again parliamentary. And then when you go to Property Rights Index of Americans for Tax Reform, again, top countries in terms of respect for property rights is parliamentary na naman yung majority. When you go down here to the top 30 easiest countries to do business, ganon din. Parliamentary na naman ang majority. Tapos ranking of top 30 countries by Human Development Index, ganon na naman. The same thing. Pare-pareho lagi yung kwento. Majority, parliamentary. Global Competitiveness Index, parliamentary na naman ang majority. Let's say it was top 20.
There's ample evidence.
It's very it's naked eye.
There's ample evidence to show. And there are also empirical studies, because some might say, kasi puro European ang nandyan or whatever, mayayaman na bansa. There are studies that show that even if you control for that, meaning to say you control for the fact that certain countries belong to Europe, you can separate the influence of that. Even if you control, like in random control studies, they say, we need to control for gender, for age, for
cultural,
smoking habits or health habits or whatever. So one way so you can do that with empirical studies, control for which region in the world you belong to, hot or cold climate, ethno-linguistic diversity, whatever. There's a particular study done by 3 Boston University professors that showed that even if you control for that, parliamentary still outperforms in all of those indicators.
In all of those indicators, yeah.
And more infant mortality, yung human development, infant mortality,
yeah.
and life expectancy. Pa nga. So isipin mo, some people say, sa dami-dami ng problema ng Pilipinas na kinahaharapan natin, COVID being one of them, bakit pa natin pinag-uusapan ng parliamentary? And yet, the evidence shows na ang buhay ng tao mismo, infant mortality and life expectancy, nakataya, nai-impluensya ng sistema ng gobyerno mo because of the ease by which programs of government are implemented, the ease by which changes are made, reforms are made, you know, the ease by which the civil service is professionalized. As Fukuyama wrote in his political origins of political order,
I think this
it
is the
took
book.
Britain 30 years to professionalize their bureaucracy after the North Code
Is it this
Rebellion.
one? Is it this one?
Yeah,
Or
the volume
political
2.
order? Yeah.
Volume 2, I think.
Yeah, I think
So he
volume
said,
2 of it. Okay.
in Britain, after the Crimean War, there was a big debacle, and there was this, you know, Parliament debated it. The North Code Rebellion report took away the command of the army from nobles, which was the practice back in those days, and gave it to professional military people. And so Fukuyama said from that point, the civil service became professionalized. It took 30 years for them to transition from patronage, bata-bata system led by the nobles, the aristocrats, to a professional civil service that we see.
A meritocratic system.
Meritocratic. In the US, after the assassination of President Garland, because a guy who was seeking office and wanted to be appointed to a particular post didn't get the appointment, he shot Garland during his inauguration or sometime after.
Garfield ba yan? Garfield, you mean? Andrew Garfield?
Sorry,
Garfield.
Supreme Court Justice. No. Garfield, yes, you're right. Early 1900s or thereabouts.
Yeah.
They enacted
Pendleton Act.
legislation, the Pendleton Act, so that office seekers, they try to remove yung mga appointees. Yeah, so civil service professionalization. And it took them, according to Fukuyama, 70 years until the 1960s before this really filtered down up to the municipal level. And some even say it still hasn't been completed to this day.
And
So
that's
you would
why
say
he's complaining about that blue book, about the 5,000.
Yes.
Until now, it's still 5,000 people that you need to change whenever an administration changes.
Yes. And so I mentioned this to one of the senators. I won't mention his name, pero kinakapatid ko to.
Okay.
Ninong ko yung tatay niya, naging senador din yung tatay niya. So maybe you get a picture. Kabrad ng father ko. Anyway, so I mentioned this na Fukuyama said 30 years versus 70 years. Ano sabi niya? Sabi niya, if it took the US 70 years and they haven't even completed it, it will take the Philippines 200 years. Sabi niya ganun.
200 years, oh my God.
Totoo nga.
Totoo nga, yeah.
It won't take that long. So you say na, ang dami nating problema. Bakit ba ang dami nating problema to begin with?
Bulok yung sistema eh.
Yes. So we said if you want better policy outcomes, ito na nga yung empirical evidence is evident and ample. We can forgive the Christian Monsods of the world, no? Kasi 1988 pa sila, yung wala pang ebidensya nun eh. But we've had the benefit of nearly 100 years of a lot of transitions to democracy in the last, let's say, 60 years, since the end of the Second World War.
Even the Cold War, yeah.
Yeah, the Eastern European transitions. We've had many years of recording good governance and these human development. Marami na tayong may observations na tayo. Marami tayong observations ng datos, no? So we can actually, and there's now empirical evidence, paper after papers coming out showing na one is superior to the other in terms of these indicators. Now, if you want some other indicator, bahala ka na, you know, kung anong pipiliin mo, no? Baka gusto mo talaga na magulo ang bansa natin, na nagbabangayan, na walang nangyayari. If you want gridlock, because the US Constitution was designed to prevent things from happening, the Madisonian Constitution, purposeful yun eh. Because the government governs least, governs best, sabi ni President Jefferson.
Jefferson, yeah.
So they constructed a system that that's very conservative in nature. na
Yeah.
mahirap talaga umusad ang mga proposals. Now, you might say that's a good thing kasi pero tinan mo naman, healthcare sa US,
Bulok
Medicare for all,
talaga.
naglalabanan pa nila. And in Australia, we've had that for such a long time already. It's not even debated anymore.
Yeah.
You know?
I think, dun sa States, parang ang nangyari rin kasi, back then, a lot of the real action really was happening at the state level, and that they wanted
Yes.
to have, parang kumbaga, most of the engine
Federal,
of economic growth was done at the state level,
yeah.
whereas yung
They wanted to
parang
limit the size of the federal government.
sa federal, parang just try to minimize it as much as possible kasi most of the stuff that needs to happen happens at the state level.
But look what has happened.
Yeah,
Look what has happened over the last several years, where the presidency has almost become imperial to the point that you have this unitary doctrine of the presidency, which says whatever the president says or does is legal. You cannot prosecute him. Under George W. Bush, diba? The legal opinion. And then under Trump, they followed it. So it's almost come to the point where the two other branches of government have become irrelevant. So a system that they designed to have checks and balances
it's not really being done. It's not being implemented.
Look how it has decayed to the point over the last 100 years, from Woodrow Wilson, who George F. Will said was the first president to try to expand the executive, to 2020 now with Donald Trump, where he almost pardoned himself. Parliamentary, walang ganyan, walang pardon. Wala, hindi pwede yung ganyan. Anong pardon yourself? Walang ganyan.
Kalokohan daw. I don't know if you're aware, Doy, si the late Claro M. Recto himself actually wanted the Philippines to go parliamentary. He wanted us to go parliamentary, and he actually had a speech, I think, basta parang I found snippets of what he said where he really criticized the presidential system and said that, you know what, we were too enamored by the US at that point in time. And now that we are already an independent country, I think it's time we start think out of the box and look at other things that are better. Kasi sabi niya, pangit talaga ang sistema na parang ano. So, and then he led a movement during the latter part of his life when he was, I think 10 years before he died. He started like pushing for tara mag-parliamentary na lang tayo. And that's what actually egged on this talk about having
Lapus, I think, also.
Yeah. That's what actually pushed
Christian
for
Democrats.
The 1971 Constitutional Convention. The 1971 Constitutional Convention didn't happen just out of the blue kasi Marcos wanted it. No, it actually was the result.
Yes, that's right.
It was a result of so many years, 20 years of people complaining about the 1935 Constitution. Na there's something better. Let's change it. And Claro M. Recto was one of those voices that said, bulok ang presidential. Mag-parliamentary na tayo. And in fact, na-delay lang na-delay yan eh. And then
he tried to run for president, didn't he? Recto?
Yeah, he did.
So did Raul Manglapos, I believe.
Yes.
And they tried to run it on the basis of party platforms. And, they tried to lift the level of discourse in the country.
Yeah.
But they found that the system just doesn't lend itself to that kind of debate. And even now, when I observe the U.S. presidential elections, a lot of it is just rhetoric.
It's rhetoric and it's celebrity politics. I mean,
whereas in a parliamentary system, people actually have to cost their policies and submit it to a parliamentary budget office where they'll determine whether totoo nga ba yung costings ninyo, whether it will really cost that much or whether you're being overly optimistic about your cost impact, budget impact. So a parliamentary system, kasi nga they've been developing policies since they're in opposition. By the time of the election, they're ready to roll them out. And usually, pati yung costing, they can seek advice from the Treasury Department. This is the only exception where they can seek advice, and for whether their costings are correct or not. And so that leads to a very mature debate. You should see the elections here in Australia, or in Britain for that matter, or Canada, na talagang very, when my dad came here, he was surprised, with how practical and how detailed the discussions were, no? Kaya yun ang sabi ko. Kung gusto niyo pa rin yung showbiz and pagwapuhan, or like a total outsider can just come in and then disband all the parties become irrelevant. Whoever wins Malacanang, that's all that matters. Then the parties realign. Gusto niyo pa rin ng ganon, and then therefore they don't even know what they stand for. Basta they just align kasi para makuha yung biyaya na
ng pork barrel.
yeah. Yun, we'll support you, whatever, Mr. President, Madam President, ganun lang. If you want that kind of system, then yeah, be my guest. And then don't be surprised na ganito pa rin ang kalalabasan ng ating bansa. Yung mga programa na hindi napapatupad, yung mga pangako na papako. So, huwag na tayo magulat. Huwag na tayo
magulat, oo.
Diba?
Yung kabulukan ng presidential talaga.
Hindi yung tao yung tao.
Tao na.
Kailangan magbago.
Nakakalimutan nila na actually yung kilos ng tao many times is pag nandun ka sa isang system. I mean, like, even in the corporate world, no? Because I've been in different companies, and yung kilos sa loob ng kumpanya na notice ko is based dun sa corporate culture, na based on the system of that company. What do they reward? What do they
the incentive structure?
Yeah. So the incentive structure in companies can be very different from one another. Some companies, bata-bata, palakasan. I mean, yung marami sa mga Pinoy companies may pagkaganyan eh. Pero yung
in
mga
the presidential system, we espouse a lot of high-minded ideals like accountability, checks and balances, separation of powers. Beautiful. However, in practice, iba ang incentives. Kaya ganun ang behavior ng tao. Kasi iba yung sinasabi mo sa yung talagang napapairal. Kasi iba yung incentive structure. I've already explained why the differences. Under a parliamentary system, iba yung incentive to go from backbencher to frontbencher. You have to toe the party line. Iba yung incentive sa civil servants. No? Because it pays to just be neutral. We don't want to play favorites. We help whoever is elected implement their policy agenda. Ganun lang. And there are practices in place that reward us for adhering to those conventions or institutions. So those conventions and institutions, madali lang naman yun i-inculcate kapag napalitan na yung sistema eh. Because may mga handbooks, we can seek advice from practitioners, na pwede namang masundan yon, no? They will come out eventually. And then, basically, the system will then just run more smoothly kapag ganon. Pero kung pagpipilitan pa rin natin na itong kotse na to, na bulok na yung makina and, madaling masira, inefficient kasi hindi integrated yung makina. So yung clutch mo, hindi integrated dun sa motor mo, sa brake mo, ganyan. Manibela mo, hindi integrated sa gulong. Nagbabangayan sila, nag-checks and balances sila. Pagpipilitan mo pa rin sakyan yung kotse na yon, hindi mo mararating yung gusto mong yung destination. Hindi mo you'll get there but in a much slower pace compared to a car which is built to be more efficient. A Ferrari which is like really well-oiled, well smooth functioning and has less hiccups, and it'll get there much quicker. So you can say, okay, unahin muna natin yung mga problema ngayon without changing the vehicle. Ang problema kasi yung makina. Overhaul mo na yung makina para mas mabilis ka tumakbo. And then all these problems that we say are top of mind and are urgent, they will be dealt with much more efficiently.
Okay.
Yun lang yung analogy.
Yeah, it's a very good analogy. All right. So, ang dami nating mga viewers, no, na may mga iba diyan na mga nagtanong, no. So,
Okay.
there's this question coming from someone named Jose Eduardo Bibar Jovillano. So, Orion Perez D,
Okay.
papatanong po, sa Australian federal model, how does the country do the auditing and counting of polls? Do they make it through bodies like COMELEC and COA that are distinct and separate from the legislature, or do they do it through bodies independent but linked to the legislature? And I think this is a great question that you can answer.
That. Yeah, okay. So may mga commissions then, electoral commissions kung tawagin, at both the federal and at the state level. However, the people who actually do the counting are usually volunteers. There's no so they're usually volunteers, and they're usually counted by hand. Kasi nga madali yung bilangan eh. An electorate might have the rule of thumb is about 200,000 ang maximum per electorate. Not sure kung 100 or 200,000 dapat yan. So, and maraming presinto. So, bawat precinct, usually, now, kino-computerize lang yan kasi in Australia, we have what's called the rank order system. Medyo komplikado yung rank order na yan. What we call preferential voting, where you actually rank the candidates.
Parang
so, who's your member of parliament? You list them 1, 2, 3, 4. And what happens is, the one with the least number of, if there's no majority, kasi kailangan majority eh, 50% plus 1 ng mga boto. So para magkaroon ng majority, minsan, you need to take out the number 5, and then yung boto, the ones who chose number 5, who ranked 5th in the counting, as their first priority, tinitignan nila kung ano yung second rank candidates dito sa 4. Distribute ngayon nila yon. That's what you call rank order. So medyo komplikado yon, kaya kina-computerize na nila yung ano. Only at that point kina-computerize nila. Pero may audit trail. Kasi mano-mano lahat eh. I think Teddy Boy Loxian has been quoted, he's tweeted a lot saying we should just go back to manual counting. But unfortunately, you can't, kasi mas transparent, may audit, may paper trail, etc. But unfortunately, you can't do that kung national ang voting. Kasi ilan ang bumoboto? 45 million? 45 million out of 110 million? No, so imposible yon. Kailangan mo talagang, para mabilis yung bilangan, kailangan may computerization ka. Pero sa parliamentary rin, yung local tsaka yung parliamentary elections, hiwalay. Kasi nga, it doesn't cost that much to hold elections, kaya pwede nilang i-desynchronize. Di katulad sa atin, presidential mula dog catcher hanggang presidente, kaya yung balota mo napakahaba.
Ilang pages yun eh, yung balota sa...
It's so expensive to run a national campaign. So, kaya feasible siya sa Australia, like we said earlier. And then yung sa COA, auditing, that is usually performed by the Auditor General's Department, AGD. But usually, ang nangyayari, they hire a consulting firm like KPMG or Accenture or one of those, Price Waterhouse, to produce their financial statements. So each agency usually produces a financial report and a management performance report. Parang board of parang kumpanya na may annual report.
Financial statement, yung ganon.
Yeah.
Annual report. Yeah, annual.
AGD does the legwork, but then the accounting bodies, they certify. Ganun usually ang pag-audit. So AGD is kind of like a department. There's a minister in charge of that department. It's not, but they are regarded as independent. They can audit me. They can audit you. Like I've been audited many times for some of the things that I've done, and you really have to submit whatever we ask for.
Okay. There's another question here, no? So may isa nagtatanong, alam ko yung may ilang bansa sa parliamentary form ay minsan may nangyayaring suntukan at bakbakan sa loob ng Kongreso.
Uh,
That's actually wrong. It's actually, I'm sorry, Eric Danog. I'm really, 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 really sorry, but that's wrong because those countries that you're talking about, the vast majority of 90% of those countries are semi-presidential.
Semi-presidential,
Those are
usually from
semi-presidential.
Eastern Europe or Russia.
Yeah.
Ukraine, for example.
Or even Taiwan and South
Taiwan has a
Korea.
president.
Yeah.
They're
So
presidential.
these are not countries that
So-
use a parliamentary system.
Uh-uh.
So it's a big mistake. I hear this a lot from many Pinoys who will try to put, parang gusto nilang siraan ang parliamentary system. Sasabihin nila, ang parliamentary system, ano yan, puro
Chaotic.
yan, may bakbakan. But that's not true. Yung pinagtuturuan nila na may bakbakan, those are not even parliamentary systems. Those are semi-presidential systems.
Yung mga Estonia, yung mga ganon, yung mga transition to democracy pa rin sila kung tawagin. And a lot of these adopted a semi-presidential system, a semi-presidential, like the Russians have.
Yes.
Nangyayari, there's an element of performance art that happens in their congresses where yung mga deputado, they're at the beck and call of the president. So, ang ginagawa nila to show na napaka-loyal nila, nagpa-front shirt fronting sila. Now, to performance art to show na napaka-loyal nila. The US congressmen who were pro-Trump were also trying to do this. Some of them tried to bring guns into the Congress, diba? Na-screen sila. They wanted to carry. And it's because you have a president who's very powerful and sumisip-sip sila. Whereas in a parliament, I want to be fair and balanced din naman. If you witness the debates in the Australian Parliament, some people get turned off. Why? Because they're really they're like children squabbling. But the other thing is that they're also on opposite sides of this dispatch box. So it's impossible to actually punch somebody.
Yeah. Oo nga eh.
But be that as it may, there is a very vigorous debate at times. Very vigorous. But you can be, by and large, I have not witnessed anybody try to punch another member of parliament. And if they did, they would be subject to sanctions. Yeah.
They'd be sanctioned. They'd be thrown out. I mean, in fact, wala pa nga.
You could say something unparliamentary, and you could be thrown out of parliament.
Yeah, I recall, Doy, even the prime minister in many occasions would be thrown out. Like, I think Tony Abbott was asked to leave. Like he said something. And I remember even in New Zealand, of one of the former prime ministers before was also asked to leave by the speaker. So, in a parliamentary debate, the speaker is the moderator who has real full control over who can stay and who gets kicked out. And even the prime minister is really just a primus inter pares, because that guy can be thrown out because of what the speaker says.
They're all on the same level. If you look at parliament, nobody is on a higher pedestal or whatever. The speaker is there, but that speaker is more like a referee.
Just a referee.
The two parties are just opposite sides of each other. And it's parliamentary procedure. It's like debating team,
Exactly.
My son's in a debating team. You argue the point. Points are raised. You argue it. In those republics, new republics that you mentioned, there's still a certain element of should we say dictatorialism from holdover from the communist Cold War
period. Yeah. Actually,
it's a strong man.
Yeah. What's happening actually increasingly, countries that were yung mga former Soviet bloc, many of them have been slowly moving towards a parliamentary system. So like a lot of them, Moldova, for example, and then you have Georgia, Armenia.
Yep.
These countries, when they first shed off their communist dictatorship model, they became presidential. They all became presidential. And then they realized na, ay, hindi pala maganda to. And so Moldova was the first na nag-shift away towards parliamentary. So nag-parliamentary
Yeah.
ang Moldova. And then the other countries like Armenia and Georgia,
Are they
nag-move sila
considering?
towards semi-presidential. And then recently, nag-parliamentary sila. So they've shifted away. Yung,
Because
syempre,
things,
yung power ratio between the president and the prime minister has been changed such that now the prime minister is the real one calling the shots and the president is the more ceremonial person.
yeah,
So these countries have moved, and the same thing also with Kyrgyzstan. So Kyrgyzstan has also shifted away.
yeah.
So parang natututo sila. And I
Look,
feel na parang
yeah.
mas una pa silang nagde-decide ng ganito kaysa sa Pilipinas.
They
We've
see
been-
the perils of a
They see the perils.
semi-presidential system has its perils, as we see in
Yeah.
Russia,
Yeah.
right?
So these countries na dating komunista, I'm feeling na parang mauunahan na naman tayo kasi the Philippines,
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
supposed to have been democratic much longer,
Yeah,
and yet we're not learning from the wrong, parang bang ano yung mga pagkakamali natin,
yeah.
we're not learning from it. We're just continuing on na naka-presidential pa rin tayo, ayaw baguhin, kesa daw chacha daw, blah blah blah,
So I
term
think we-
extension. Ay,
we
naku.
suffered a lot of trauma from our experience. So, like Russia, the Philippines is similar actually in the sense that
Yeah.
we swing from total anarchy of a democracy to autocracy, where a strong man prevails. And the reason for that is because when there's so much anarchy, people just want order. That's all they want.
Yeah.
If your population is dying and from and it's shrinking because men are killing themselves, then you want somebody to restore order. But the thing is, the reason why it's so anarchic here is partly because of the presidential system. And the reason why nagsasapakan sila sa floor of parliament, for me, part of it is because of frustration. People are just so frustrated that they just can't get on with the business of government, the efficient thing, as Beijhot you quoted earlier. They just end up, settling it with fists rather than, principled platforms. Because, if you go to an election promising a platform, when you win, it's expected that you should be able to implement it. Whereas in a presidential system, you may promise a bunch of things, but then when you get elected, hindi pa rin sigurado kung yun talaga ang policy ng gobyerno. Pagdidebatihan pa yan. And ang daming centers of power na usually ang nangyayari, nagko-collide yan. Whereas sa parliamentary, there's more harmony built into the system because of the thing that I just mentioned. And so sometimes you even find opposition parties saying, on this particular proposal, we will vote with the government because we don't really have any objections to it now, A. And pangalawa, we recognize that they had a mandate to implement this. So we are not going to block it or whatever. And in the US, may mga filibuster pa yan or kung
Ay,
ano
naku.
pwedeng gawin.
Stupid system.
Walang ganon sa parliamentary. Rinirespeto ang mandato. And isa lang yung mandato, hindi dalawa o tatlo. Isa lang yung mandato, and the government of the day, therefore, is able to forge ahead with its agenda.
May isa ako nakita ditong question, So, sinabi ni Donnie Sanguine, I agree with your point, sir, but meron po bang negative side ng parliamentary? Just want to know po. Thank you. So from me, from my point of view, having just really done all the comparisons, I don't see any negative side for the parliamentary. What people consider to be the so-called negative is just a perception that ay hindi na natin maboboto yung magiging main leader. That's what they think. But actually, pwede mo naman botohin kung gusto mo si ganito yung maging leader. Tingnan mo, sino yung leader ng party? So yung leader na yan ng party na yan, yun ang gusto mo maging leader, edi boto mo yung party. Which is, so parang wala na talagang wala na talagang
Donnie,
issue sa parliamentary. Actually,
yeah.
I find that there is nothing negative at all with parliamentary and with presidential, puro lang
Compared to the,
negative. Puro
well,
lang
Donnie,
negative ang presidential.
we should thank Donnie for his question because
Yeah, indeed.
baka naman puro we just taking in, views that agree with us, no, and we're not being open-minded. Let's try to be open-minded for a second here or two. Okay, sige, Donnie, theoretically, ito yung mga sinasabi nilang mga downside ng parliamentary, yung executive and legislative is fused. So sabi nila walang separation of powers, no? Mas maraming separation of decentralized ang power sa presidential. So it's more ideal pagka ganon. Tama yun. Under parliamentary, the executive and legislative are more integrated. But I've already explained that even if that is the case, na hindi separated yung powers, mas marami pa rin checks and balances under a parliamentary system, which leads me to quote Winston Churchill, where he said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the rest." Meaning to say, it's the worst form of government, but there's no other alternative. Okay, parliamentary system. And then he also said another thing. He said, "You can rely on the I don't know if he said the Yanks or the Americans. You can rely on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other possible option." Bakit? Kasi sa presidential system, ang daming humihirit. So they will try to accommodate. And they will often get it wrong so many times before they get it right. Case in point is healthcare in the US. Okay? So they've had this system, and it's the same system that we have in the Philippines where it's insurance-based. Barack wanted he took Romney Care and said this is something that the Republicans can get behind because it's one of their own. They still opposed it. He wanted a public option, which means that if you can't afford to pay for your insurance, the government if they're all expensive, the government will provide a cheaper alternative, public option. Hindi pa rin pumasa yun. So, ang nangyari, they tried Obamacare and they found that tumaas yung premiums. Ang mahal. So, ang daming nag-rebelde, ganyan, let's get rid of it. Pero ang daming namang nakinabang. So, anong gustong gawin ngayon ni Joe Biden? First of all, Bernie Sanders wanted Medicare for all. Let's make it universal like they have it in Canada and in Australia. Joe Biden's more moderate. He said, let's just have a public option, which is what Barack wanted to begin with. He's starting to backtrack from that position now. So again, it's set up to fail. So many compromises kasi along the way. Unlike the rest of the developed world in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, where we've settled that question a long time ago. And in fact, we have better health outcomes with lower healthcare spending because we've settled the question already. And why? Another case in point, gun laws in the US. Ang daming patayan, ang daming shooting. They've been trying to enact common sense reforms. They're not going to get rid of the Second Amendment or whatever it is. Just common sense reform, background checks, waiting periods, etc. Common sense. Majority of Americans now are for it, but they can't get it passed. Hanggang ngayon, they're probably going to wait another 10, 20 years. It's not even being debated, talked about. It wasn't even a campaign issue, despite Black Lives Matter and all of that. Look at New Zealand. Nagkaroon ng isang incident na shooting, okay, with an automatic, in a church, in a mosque. No? Jacinda Ardern. He just said, we must make it the case that hindi mangyayari ito uli. What happened? Cabinet debated proposal. And may kaalyado siya. Kasi sa kanila, mixed member representation parang proportional. So may coalition partner, the Nationals, who are usually pro-gun. Pinagdebatihan nila sa kabinete. When they decided that was it, pasado na sa parliament. Kasi they hold the majority in parliament. Party discipline. Australia, ganun din ang nangyari. There was an incident back in the 90s, John Howard's first term in office.
Is it Tasmania?
Port Arthur massacre. Port Arthur massacre.
Yeah.
A long firearm. John Howard, a conservative, with his country liberals who are pro-gun, usually. They said, no more long firearms, no more automatic weapons. Pasado sa kabinete, pasado sa parliament. Tapos na ang usapan. Di ba? Ganun lang kabilis yun eh. And we've had no massacres since then. None. And so I'm saying, ganun kabilis ang reforma sa parliamentary system. Now, you might say, kapag ganun kabilis, hindi na pag-iisipan. I already explained how policies are developed and how coordination takes place in the cabinet office where we say, have you consulted with that? Yeah. So they're well thought out. Even from opposition, they're already preparing those policies. When they come into office, and the whole machinery of government is in, we don't always get it right, no? Don't always get it right. Some things are still ideologically driven and so forth, but there's less of that. There's more of a respect, when you're in opposition that nanalo kayo, you deserve to have your agenda enacted.
Here's one thing I noticed, I remember before there was this a comparison between presidential and parliamentary. Na yung lumalabas nga sa presidential, it's so hard to get things through that if a bad thing does get through, it's so hard.
Ang hirap baguhin. Yes.
Hirap ayusin. Ngayon sa parliamentary, okay, so it's actually easier to get things done. And it's actually hard to get the wrong things through kasi nga ang daming debates na mangyayari before that happens. Just in case may lumusot or mali, pwede siya baguhin agad.
Ang nangyayari sa atin, nag-e-enact ng batas. And then ano mangyayari? Congress pass a law, president can veto it. What if the president can be overridden by Congress? Or if the president signs it, it will go to the civil servants who are going to write the IRR, the Internal Rules and Regulations. And often what happens is the IRR goes against the ethos or the intentions of the lawmakers. Now, that problem will never happen under a parliamentary system. Why? Because the agencies that formulate the IRR report to the minister, who was the one who proposed the legislation.
Yes.
So this is what I'm saying, integrated sila eh.
Yes.
Imposible na, hindi katulad sa presidential, watak. You spent 30 years campaigning, kunwari, for this law to be enacted. Finally, it gets passed. Like Freedom of Information Act, whatever you call it, you name it. Nagkampanya ka pa, 10 taong kunwari, nag-build ka pa ng coalition, you finally got it passed to Congress. Yay! And then when it goes down to the executive department for implementation, they draft an IRR that restricts it significantly to the point that it's practically toothless or useless. Ganun ang mangyayari. Ganun ang mangyayari po. So, the congressmen, pogi pa rin sila kasi pinasa namin, we're so progressive. Pero hindi nyo alam na yung mga bata niya na pina-appoint niya sa mga departamento na nagpo-formulate ng batas, binuluto nila in such a way na hindi pa rin mapapatupad yan. Kaya yan ang mga pitfalls, perils of the presidential system na hindi natin napapag-usapan pero nandiyan yan, built-in yan sa sistema na yan. Under parliamentary, as I said, the minister, his office often comes up with the proposal. It's drafted by the department, sent to the parliamentary office to draft it in legalese language, whatever. But once it's voted by cabinet and then drafted by, then it's go. All systems go. And then the implementing rules and regulations are under the jurisdiction of the minister who proposed the legislation in the first place. So there's no opportunity for misalignment. And if there is, madali rin i-correct, as you said.
Galing. So, talaga? I think it's become very, very clear na talagang in almost all aspects, pretty much. Mas maganda talaga ang parliamentary. Kahit anong balibaliktad di ba?
Okay. I was brought up to believe that the presidential system was the best form of
I
government
thought the same. I thought the same
because
before.
my father was a political scientist. He was a con delegate. He was trained in the U.S. So he really followed the philosophies and all of that. But when I migrated and when I worked in the system, I started to realize, because I was also of the view na and they just want to be in power, to be reelected, walang term limit, stay hang on to power. And I used to believe that as well. But I came to the realization when I worked and saw how it actually operates, na it's so much easier and better to get things done under this system, much more efficient. And when I started explaining it even to my dad, even he started to nod his head and say like, "Oh, I didn't know
Oh,
that."
ano,
Because a
yeah.
lot of these things are not; these are not the theory. These are
Yeah,
the
yeah.
practice.
It's a
This is the
practice. Yeah.
practice. Ayun.
Ako, my inamulat ako actually was when I came to Singapore also. So I've been a long time proponent of federalism since high school pa. So it was a
Mm-mm.
product of my being half Manileño, half Cebuano.
Mm-mm.
Born born in Metro
Sure.
Manila, spent most of my time
Grew
in
up.
Metro Manila until I was grade 5, and then pag grade
Yeah.
6 we moved to Cebu, and my dad is Cebuano. And
Mm-hmm.
before that, we were already going to Cebu a lot. So I would spend vacations in Cebu, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it was when I started living in Cebu that I had this idea that, oops, we need to have a different system. We can't have this unitary system. We need to have federalism. So parang dun pa lang, pro-federalism na ako. And
Mm-mm.
um, high school and college, I was already pro foreign direct investment. Sabi ko, ay kailangan talaga ng
Mm-mm.
trabaho. Especially when
Mm-mm.
we started having these mga namamatay na mga OFW and all that stuff. I said, ba't ng konti
Yeah.
ng trabaho? Let's bring in investors na lang so that they'll create jobs in the Philippines para hindi na
Yeah.
kailangan lumabas. Pero yung parliamentary, hindi ko pa talaga naintindihan. Before I used to be presidential na merong electoral college na lang, ganon.
Mm-mm.
Or
Mm-mm.
presidential na may runoff. I was looking at these
Yeah,
presidential
yeah, yeah. Which
before.
is electoral college. It has dimensions of a parliamentary
Because it has a
setup.
very parliamentary-ish way of doing things also.
Electoral college kasi.
Yeah, it's a college. Eh. So it is a parallel Congress that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
elects the president, diba? So sabi ko, yun
Yeah.
na lang, And then,
Mm.
but when I came to Singapore, and I was so impressed with how Singapore was such a dynamic and
Yeah.
fast-moving society, very very pragmatic and very well
Yeah.
run. I tried to understand how did Lee
Yeah.
Kuan Yew do it, and I found out it was because it was a parliamentary
The
system.
British Westminster system.
British
Now,
Westminster
I,
system.
I want to tackle this because a lot of people say now we're trying to become like Singapore or Malaysia, meaning to say the PPP has been in power there
PAP.
since its independence, diba? So is that what we're trying to achieve? Now, since the time of Ramos and the Venetia was proposing we shift to parliamentary, people were saying, no, you just want to extend you want to hang on, like what they're doing in East Asia now. So these states like Japan, South Korea, they are what I call confusion states.
Confusion. Yeah.
We're not like that at all. So the danger that this will turn into a one-party state or whatever, I don't think it's going to be
It's
like
not
that.
there. Yeah.
To be honest, because we have a different culture. In Confucian states, kasi it's about the family. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
about
They're
the
very
collective.
collectivist.
So filial piety, my loyalty to we're deferential. We're not individuals. We're part of it, which is a beautiful concept. Really, we need to learn more of that, acquire more of that. To be honest, our individualism is really what leads to a lot of these social problems like drug addiction and stuff, depression and stuff like that, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But however, we don't have that culture. Actually, if we were to shift, I believe that politics will still be competitive because knowing how Filipinos are,
Yeah, yeah.
We're never content. That's why whenever you go overseas, there's two societies of Bicolanos. There's two, you know,
Indeed,
you
indeed.
know, because we don't. It's very hard for us to achieve unity as a country. Now,
Mm.
the opposite. They've also argued from the opposite angle. They said, kapag naging parliamentary, baka puro every 90 days may vote of no confidence magiging, so they go from saying autocracy 50 years in power to saying every 90 days magkakaroon ng change in
Ay
government
nako,
knowing how.
puro fake news nila.
No,
Actually
but
nga, yung sinasabi nilang ganyan na lagi nag-change, that happens in countries that have a low threshold proportional representation
yeah, yeah.
electoral system,
Yung kapag
because
coalition,
kasi coalition based sila. So
mm, mm.
yun yung
Like
difference.
in
So
Germany, the
oo,
federal. But usually,
exactly.
yung mga coalition na yun, magkakalapit sila in terms of
Magkakalapit
their
naman sila.
program of
Yeah.
government. So
Indeed.
kung center-left siya, Christian Democrats, ang kalyado nila is the pro-business party or ano. Minsan lang nagkakaroon ng unity na left and right, nag-unity government. But usually, it's like coalition ng mga like-minded
Like-minded.
parties.
Yeah, yeah.
And usually, in a parliamentary system, there could be a change in government. There could be a change in administration without a change in government. Meaning to say, within the same coalition or ruling party, they could change the leader, so there could be a change. Now, but by and large, stable pa rin siya.
Stable pa
No?
rin. The policy directions are still the same or very, very similar. It's not a
Tweak
sudden,
lang here and
parang
there.
hindi siya sudden na
Yeah.
nag-change ng ganyan. So,
Hindi
yeah,
nagkakaroon ng about things.
like
And
Abbott,
because of like Abbott.
Abbott to Turnbull and then Turnbull to ScoMo. It's like, I mean,
Yeah.
they're same party
In
naman
fact,
sila eh.
In fact, the reasons why Australia has had, what is it, 6 or 8 prime ministers in the last 10 years. Howard was there for 12 years, 13 years, yata. And then since Howard, it's been very unstable. You know why? It's because the campaigns have become more presidential.
Yeah, become more presidential. Yeah,
The popularity polls, when they see that the preferred prime minister is the opposition leader, that's when the ruling party starts to think, oh, we need to change our leader.
We need to change our leader. Yeah, and I think
Every
it's also
15,
partly.
yeah.
It's partly it's all. And I did some analysis on this. No, I saw that part of the problem here is the 3-year term. The 3-year term is a little too short, considering that now the feedback loops, because of internet and social media, are much faster. During the time of John Howard, they did not yet have the same kind of polls. The opinion polls were not yet of the same parang
Or they
speed.
didn't pay attention to them too much.
Maybe they didn't. Maybe they didn't. But back then they were not that. They were not that big. Diba? So any small parang opinion poll bumaba si John Howard, hindi naapektuhan yung kanyang standing within his party. Whereas because of the internet age and social media, parang naging mabilis yung feedback nung na oy, ang dami kumukontra kay sa party natin. We have to do something. And they're so jittery because it's a 3-year. It's a very short. It's a very short 3-year.
Every politician who says, I don't pay attention to the polls, there's only one poll that counts, they're lying, obviously.
Yeah.
They do care about it.
They do.
But I think because we've kind of adopted presidential style campaigns, and also so even nakaka-erosion din sa parliamentary system where hindi nila latag out in detail minsan yung policies, or kung minsan they don't speak about it until the election campaign begins. So there is that kind of decay that can happen in any system. But the decay is happening because we're becoming, the campaigns are becoming like presidential in nature.
Yeah.
Where it's about the prime minister, the leader has to be media, and this media ecology now of social media and cable media and blogs and everything like that has really made it such that the leader has to be or the leaders have to be facing the cameras a lot of the time.
Yeah, media based.
And so yeah, so it is changing the way campaigns are run. We can't deny that. But what I can say is compare what happened in Britain to what happened in the US with the Brexit vote, and how they've managed the transition. In Britain, the populist fringe party was the UKIP party, the UK Independent Party. No?
Yeah.
And these were the guys that were anti-immigration, anti-trade, anti-Europe. Now, they did not, however, take over the Tories, the way the Trump wing of the Republican Party has now taken over the Republican Party. Right?
Yeah.
Because in the US, it's really crazy, no? It's really presidential in nature. So it's not even a matter of principles or ideas anymore. It's like, are you with Trump or against Trump? So Trump, having his millions of Twitter followers, he just needed to tweet against his own party mates who are not towing the line, and then they would primary him, and at risk they would get a more pro-Trump person to run in the primaries against
here's the funny thing too. People probably forget that Trump was not even originally a Republican. He was a Democrat. He was friends with Clintons. He dominated. He campaigned for, raised funds for the Clintons before. So actually, it's like, it's weird because ano sila eh, they were actually, he was originally a Democrat, and then suddenly, because of his fame, he could suddenly become a front runner in the Republican Party just because he was a famous celebrity.
Parang naging Pilipinas na nga ang states eh. Na yung president, there was an outsider who ran, was popular, he ran, he won. And then the party aligned to the president. The Congress aligned. So they became more pro-Trump. The moderates had to become more pro-Trump, even though they were moderates. So parang ganun, parang naging Pilipinas ng states eh. And he controlled so much power na they had no choice. Whereas in a parliamentary system like in the UK, they went through another election and then the UKIP party faded. So the populists faded. And the same thing happened in Germany with Merkel. At first, there was a parang Germany first. Parang yun yung ibig sabihin ng in German eh. There was a right-wing fringe, but the German constitution, the way it's built now, is designed to prevent, the rise of the same repeat of Nazi. So because remember, Hitler was popularly elected, so they've constructed it in such a way na fringe siya. They just went through another election, and again, that fringe faded away. So you can see in a parliamentary system, mas stable siya, less subject to the sudden turn, change
whims
of
and
the political winds. Yes, exactly. It's a presidential system. It can deal with a bad emperor. So the problem of the bad emperor, like the mad emperor, who claims the mandate from heaven, ang hirap tanggalin ang presidente. He's there for 4 years. Baka ma-re-elect pa nga. Trump might almost got re-elected. If not for COVID, he probably would have been re-elected. That's my honest opinion. But in a parliamentary system, there is that escape valve. When the pressure, it allows you to manage the transition much more smoothly. There's less of a disruption in the life of the nation, unlike what we have, where there's gridlock and then nagkaka-people power, and then
here's what I think, no? Parang nakikita ko nga ang difference between the two systems is that the presidential system assumes that people can be perfect. Na parang there's a perfect person, and we all supposedly make the perfect choice of this person. So that person now is expected to do the perfect stuff. So do everything. So within that term, dapat parang so-called perfect yung ginagawa niya. Hindi mo siya matatanggal unless he really does something wrong. In a parliamentary system, it is assumed that people do make mistakes. It's assumed that people can make wrong decisions, and that these wrong decisions must be corrected, or that if you make the choice of say that the party chose the wrong person to be the leader and that person turns out to be lousy, then the party has the choice to get rid of that leader midstream,
Yeah.
which you don't have in a presidential system
You
because
don't
it's
have the mechanism.
walang na
You
mechanism na ganun.
don't have the mechanism of accountability. The executive can claim because he's got the popular mandate from people directly.
Yeah,
And unlike the executive, the chief executive in the parliamentary system, where his mandate comes from his colleagues from the parliament,
yes.
which is elected by the people. So, in a way, when they replace a prime minister through a vote of no confidence, it is the mandate from the people that allows them to replace the president. So, yun ang mga difference, no, in terms of the political theory of it, no. In practice, what we can also see is that it's so the transactions cost of going through an impeachment and removal from office, sometimes it doesn't succeed. You invest so much in that process and it becomes politicized, and you end up with this polarized scenario because the wound is allowed to fester for so long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so even if he's removed, he comes back, as in the case of ERA with EDSA 3. So you see what happens here? That dynamic has been playing out in the Philippines for the last 20 years at least, since the early 2000s of EDSA 2 and EDSA 3. And up to now, the Liberal Party, although they may deny it, on Twitter, I see, they want to oust. There was a hashtag, oust Duterte. And then I asked somebody who was tweeting, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Like, Leni Robredo is such a is more presidential. We must install her. What do you mean by that? How are you going to install her? So you're not saying we should go through an impeachment process? So aminado sila that they're actually trying to use extra constitutional means to replace Duterte.
The very same stuff that Lintz was talking about, that is like yung perils of presidentialism, that because of the lousy system in the presidential system, you now have military and adventurism and all kinds of extra.
It leads to all of these things,
stuff.
Whether mob rule or military adventurism or extra constitutional methods. It leads to all sorts of shenanigans that we don't want to get into, because when you wade into those waters, you're in no man's land now. Who knows how are you going to regain legitimacy? So the last 20 years has been about that. Gloria Arroyo, and then the new president, and then Aquino, who had many stumbling blocks because he was dealing with the midnight appointments of Arroyo, the Corona impeachment trials, and so that prevented him from implementing his agenda. And that would have never happened.
I think he didn't even have an agenda.
Or he had a notion of an agenda which he didn't know how to implement because there was no professional bureaucracy with the practice of informing the incoming government on how to implement their policy prescriptions. You don't have that because under presidential, the PMS, so where I work is the equivalent of the presidential management staff, the presidential, where we process all the cabinet papers. That is, to my mind, under our system, all run by political appointees. No?
Under the Philippine system, yeah.
Under the presidential system, because they want his own people there. But under our system, it's run by professional bureaucrats like myself, civil servants, who know their stuff, who've been working on it for decades and years. So they know how to advise. Whereas yung mga baguhan na dumarating na hindi nila alam, these PMS, we consider them as just ministerial staff. Mga personal staff lang ng minister yan. They don't actually run the agency. We do. So we can advise. So they can listen to their advisors. That's fine. But we also provide independent advice to the government through our cabinet office comments. So they get to hear an impartial third-party view from the budget office, treasury, and from cabinet office. And that leads to better, more informed decision-making, which we don't have under our current system.
Wow. It's so sad talaga na we're stuck with a really lousy system ladies and gentlemen, talagang problema talaga tong presidential system ng Pilipinas. Kailangan talagang baguhin ito. In fact, mas importante nga to kaysa sa federalism muna, no? Federalism kasi is a very long-term thing. Parliamentary is actually the more important one kasi mas ano yun eh, mas nakikita natin yung immediate results, no? So,
And look, you say that the 3-year term is problematic, but I actually think that in our case, we could actually move to it kasi 3 years yung Congress every 3 years. So actually, it would be less of a disruption if we actually move to a parliamentary system kasi every 3 years na yung natin election system.
Sa Pilipinas. Yeah.
But I'll have a lot to say about the federal system. Maybe we can tackle that on a separate.
We'll have another one. Yeah, let's have another one.
Because I work also under a federal system, so I know how it operates as well.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, wow, we've had a really great discussion here. Here, me and Doy, and so much to learn talaga. Yun nga lang, we don't have all the time in the world because like right now it's already been 2 hours plus.
Tayo dun sa other
overtime. Pero kasi nga, that's the nice thing about this. We can extend if we wanted to. So I think a lot of people are really learning so much, and and then later on this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen,
if there are more questions, I'm happy to discuss them some other time.
Yeah. We could check out the stuff that we have here, and then we could then have a separate session.
Sending them.
Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon, don't forget, it's already afternoon now here in Singapore and the Philippines. It's 1:09 p.m. So basically, in 2 hours' time, at 3 p.m. Singapore, KL, Hong Kong, and Manila, Philippines time, Sas Rogando Sasot will be having her discussion with my friend Dr. Eduardo Araral Jr. So that one is about why is the presidential system problematic. So yan, parang magandang ano rin yan na pinapag-usapan natin. We set the stage for them. Diba? We said bakit mas magandang parliamentary. And we also did tackle some stuff about the presidential. Bakit
perils. The perils.
Yeah. And they'll be talking more about that in their talk at 3 p.m. So puntahan ninyo ang For the Motherland, Sas Rogando Sasot page. And we will also share that link here sa CoRRECT Movement. So we really want a lot of people to learn about why we need these changes. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Emmanuel Doy Santos Jr. Tama yun, di ba? Junior ka talaga sa totoo lang, di ba?
The second.
Yeah.
The second. In Australia, I dropped the second.
You dropped that. Kasi parang sa atin, right. Sa US lang yan, no? So you just call yourself Doy Santos. And I'm pretty sure you have some final words for our viewers.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much again for giving me this opportunity to talk about my personal, professional knowledge of how the parliamentary system works. All I can say at the conclusion of this discussion is that whether you're for or against this change, it's important that we have an open dialogue and discussion based on the merits of the arguments, and not base it on views about the motives for why this is being proposed. I think it's important for the merits, if you're pro-presidential, for the merits of that to stand on its own and not argue that, because you guys just want to do. No. If the presidential system is really better for us in the Philippines, then that argument should stand on its own 2 feet and not have to rely on a bogeyman to say that why we shouldn't shift at all. And so in that regard, I think we need to approach it with humility. We need to look at the evidence, both the empirical and historical evidence. I think we've alluded to some of those things. And we need to also look at the practices, because those will really help us understand better. So we're very familiar with the presidential system, and we often hear people attack the other system. but without a deep knowledge of what it really entails. And so that's all I'm trying to present to you. Whether it happens within Duterte's term or afterwards, it's another debate to have. All I'm saying is we need to be open to these discussions because the country has been going through these cycles in its transition to democracy. And if there's a better system, if there are lessons from other countries, then we should be willing to and humble enough to listen to those lessons. So thank you. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you again for those final words for our audience. Doy, maraming salamat sa iyo, Doy. I mean, really, I really enjoy all these discussions, especially yung before we had this one today, yung mga offline discussions natin.
Yeah.
Galing, I learned so much from you, especially from the practitioner view. You know, because I take a lot of my stuff from just observing it from the outside. Although I live in a country that uses a parliamentary system, but I don't work inside the halls of parliament or inside the
you don't see the guts of it, how the sausage making.
You get to see that. You know, and that's really great. I mean, this is really great added value to everyone who's listening in today. Kasi talagang now, they have a clear view kung ano talagang nangyayari sa background, which they wouldn't have had if they just listened to those of us who have a very, how do you say this, much more theoretical treatment of the topic. So thank you.
There's nothing wrong with theory. There's nothing wrong with theory. I think it lends a lot of perspective to the discussions. It tells you what should happen, but there's a difference between what should happen and what normally does happen or how things actually operate. So I think that's what I'm happy to lend that to the discussion. You know, how it operates in practice. But I'm so impressed with you as well in terms of your knowledge of a lot of the literature and a lot of the thinking around this. You've really done your homework. So that's quite impressive in and of itself. And I think we just need to lend all our voices to this discussion, because that's what needs to happen for us to really resolve the issue once and for all. Because there's repeated cries for this, and there must be a reason why it keeps cropping up.
Indeed. Yun. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you to all our viewers, listeners, our audience, everyone. Thank you for sharing the link, and thank you for watching. Thank you for bearing with us for pretty much 3 hours already. 2 hours and 53 minutes. You know, it's long, but I'm pretty sure you all enjoyed it and have learned so much. So please continue to keep on spreading this and sharing this link to so many people so that more people can learn. And again, thank you, Doy. Thank you talaga for your time. Thanks. I cannot thank you enough.
I'm happy to do it. Look, and anytime you need me back, I'm happy to come back and have more of this discussion.
All right. So let's have another one. Let's have another one next time. Let's talk maybe again about the parliamentary system, some aspects of it. We can then later also talk about federalism. We can also talk about openness to foreign investors and all that. So, you know, there's a lot that we can talk about. I mean, galing. And ladies and gentlemen, again, just to remind you all, wag niyong kakalimutan yung kay Sas Ruganto Sasot and Dr. Ed Araral at 3 p.m. So, panood po kayo. Learn as much as you can. Use this Sunday to learn about what's wrong with our form of government and what form of government we need to adopt so that we can have a better country, a better Philippines, a better future for us and our children and grandchildren. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks again, Doy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maraming salamat sa lahat ng mga audience natin. Thank you. Have a good day.